We came north to save the realm. The words threw Ned. Save. From whom? The Boltons. Davos blinked. He cast a wary eye at Stannis as if unsure what to say. When his master offered no support or command, he steeled himself and pushed bravely on. There are more sinister threats to the realm than that posed by those at the Dread Fort. This served to do nothing but cause Ned even more confusion. I'll have to ask you to explain, sir. Once again Sir Davos stayed his hand. It was only when Stannis gave a slight nod of assent that he ploughed on, committed now to telling the tale. We received a raven from Castle Black, my lord. One of the few to successfully get past the Bolton and Karstark archers. It arrived at Storm's End carrying the word that Lord Commander Mormont was dead and that it was expected that the wall would shortly come under attack from a wildling army led by Mance Rayder. The watch called for aid. Ned fought the desire to frown in disbelief, and you resolved to answer. Davos eyed his liege lord uneasily. Stannis might as well have been a statue, so rigidly he sat in his saddle, his eyes fixed on something behind Ned. He was unmoving, unbending. The knight returned to Ned. We did, my lord. Why? Stannis's eyes flickered. I am the rightful king of Westeros, Lord Stark. I had word that the realm itself was under attack. Where else would I be? It makes a kind of sense, I suppose. His grace saved the watch, my lord, Davos claimed with a certain sense of pride. The wildling force was broken before the wall. Those that were not taken captive were scattered back into the frozen wastelands from whence they came. A pity that we did not take more, Stannis said, eyes blazing, his expression one of regret rather than of pride in defeating a foe. The ones that escaped will likely join the enemy. The familiar cloud of confusion took hold of Ned yet again. Enemy. Surely the wildlings were the enemy. He shifted his weight in the saddle. Are you concerned they will reform their lines and attack once more? Stannis looked at Ned as if he were an idiot. No, my lord, the host was broken. I am more concerned that those fleeing will be picked off and added to the army of the dead by the White Walkers. The statement was said so calmly, so matter-of-factly, that Ned almost laughed. Only the deadly serious expression of Stannis Baratheon and downcast face of Davos Seaworth deterred him from saying anything at first. You're speaking of fables, my lord, Ned said eventually, his voice low. Stories to frighten children into staying in their beds. He glanced between Stannis and Sir Davos. The others, the White Walkers, have been gone from these lands for thousands of years. They were defeated. They have returned, Stannis stated with the same detached expression he had had at the beginning of the meeting. It was a sincere look though, and one that convinced Ned that Stannis believed what he said. It gave him pause. Gods! Could it be possible? The others had been a fixture of children's tales in the north for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. Ned believed the stories but was firmly reassured that they were in the past. The greatest threat in the north was the wildlings, not evil spectres made of ice. Sir Davos stirred uneasily, unnerved by Ned's silence. Your boy went beyond the wall, my lord. He has fought the dead and lived to tell the tale. Jon. Ned's mind flashed to the horrors Jon must have faced beyond the wall in a land of savages and death. The guilt was almost overwhelming. I sent him there, or, at least, allowed him to go. Your son does you credit, Lord Stark, Stannis declared. He has fought nobly to defend the realm. He shook his head in mild rebuke. At least one Stark upholds his oaths and does his duty. Even Sir Davos's grimace did not waylay the spark of anger that ignited Ned's heart. What you say is perhaps the truth, Ned allowed heavily with a reflective edge in his voice. All of it. And I would be minded to heed your words were it not for the source. Stannis stared for a moment. Explain yourself. He commanded, with an edge of menace behind his words. You say you are the rightful king and that, as king, you must defend the realm. Ned said hesitantly, on both counts, I agree with you. For a brief moment Stannis's eyes flared in triumph. Then order your son to stand down. Have him give up the crown and have his bannermen swear themselves to me. Command them to march on the wall to defend the realm from the great other who threatens all life in this world. Ned felt the moment of decision had arrived. He had a choice now, obey the man who he was, by oath, sworn to, or support his son. For Ned the decision was not as hard as he once thought it would be. He shook his head sadly. I regret, my lord, that I cannot. Stannis's head tilted. His bearing had all the danger of a coiled snake. Do not bandy words, my lord. It is not that you cannot, you will not. Fine then. You are correct. Ned kept his face calm. I will not support you. Robert would be surprised, my lord, Stannis remarked slyly. He was often given to remark on the honor of his vaunted friend Ned Stark. God's is that jealousy beneath his words. Stannis shook his head once more. And yet now we find that honor and duty takes second place next to the vaunting ambition of family members. One could say the same of you, Ned replied angrily. As I recall, you sided with your brother over the Mad King. If you had done your duty, your grace, you would have rallied your men for Aerys and marched to support him. Stannis said nothing for a while. His eyes went to the frosted landscape. Finally his gaze returned to Ned's. That was the hardest decision I have ever made, Lord Stark. But it is one that I do not regret. Aerys Targaryen called for Robert's death when he had committed no crime. There are older laws than those made by a king. There is natural justice. I could not support a man who would kill my older brother. Beneath the icy exterior Ned saw a flash of the man in front of him. Saw the second son of Steffon Baratheon look back at him. A man in awe of a brother, jealous perhaps but filled with love and affection that made him be loyal to the man even if he refused to acknowledge those feelings, even to himself. From any other man it was moving, to see a hint of such emotion from the like of Stannis was almost unbelievable. It was almost enough to make one's heart thaw. Except. And what of your younger brother? Ned repressed another sigh. He wished it had not come to this. What of Renly? Stannis frowned. Wrong-footed, what of him? Did you have him killed because he failed to heed the same order to bend the knee to you? To the side of his master Sir Davos reeled as if struck. He looked anxiously between the lord in front of him and the king at his side. His master ground his teeth hard, his eyes black flints, but he said nothing in reply. Abruptly the Onion Knight found his voice. You appear to be misinformed, my lord. Lord Renly died in the custody of House Tyrell. His tragic death had nothing to do with his grace. Forgive me, Sir Davos, Ned said sadly, but I hear different. I have heard that the man responsible for the death was none other than his older brother. It was a hunch. Ned had no evidence for his words other than some wild claims from Brienne of Tarth. Even so, now that he faced the man and could look him in the eye, Ned was sure that Lord Selwyn's daughter was not mistaken. For a long time Stannis said nothing. He merely looked contemplatively at Ned. The fact that he did not angrily protest at what Ned had said spoke volumes as far as the Lord of Winterfell was concerned. Sir Davos looked as if he was drowning, confronted with accusations that made him both uncomfortable and disgusted. There can be no proof of this, my lord, he protested thinly. It is absurd. No more absurd than telling a Northman that the White Walkers have returned. Ned could see from Davos' face that for all his words to the contrary, something was deeply troubling him. This one has no talent for lying. He turned his gaze on the man he would accuse. I put it to you that you caused Renly's death. Do you deny it? Please, in the name of Robert, deny it. So what if I did? Stannis hissed angrily. He seemed to shake with repressed rage. He sought to usurp my claim with one of his own. It was treachery, plain and simple. His lip curled, and treachery can only have one answer. Davos Seaworth looked shocked to his core. He looked as if he might be sick. Ned sighed heavily. He realized that he had never truly believed Brian's claim. It was only when faced with the man that the accusation had come screaming back to him. He wished now he had been wrong. Robert would be ashamed. As bad a king as he was, as frequent as his drunken rages took him, my old friend would never have turned on a member of his family. No matter the crime. What Renly tried to do was wrong, Ned allowed, but to be slain by an assassin. He eyed the other man suspiciously. The Lady Brienne said something about a shadow. How it was done is not your concern, Stannis replied gruffly. But I shall not deny that I ordered his death. He set himself even more rigidly in his saddle. I gave the command. I do not regret it. The angry retort that flew to Ned's lips was cut off as he saw the look of pain cross the face of Sir Davos. The sight gave Ned pause. The man didn't know, He had no conception that his lord and master ordered the death of his brother. No man, no matter his crime, is more accursed than the kinslayer, my lord, Ned declared quietly. And that is where your own ambition has taken you. It was not ambition, Stannis bristled angrily. And I will not stand here to be judged by you. The Iron Throne is mine by right. Anyone that denies that are my foes. He fixed Ned with a steady gaze. Anyone. Gods be good. Is it also true that you burn your enemies now, my lord? Ned asked, eyeing the flaming heart banner that Davos held in his mutilated hand. In for a penny, in for a dragon. That you sacrifice them to the Lord of Light. Sir Davos looked down in shame. I have burned those that warrant such punishment, Stannis replied emotionlessly as he kept his eyes on Ned. It was necessary. Ned matched the man's stare with one of his own. He was not about to be intimidated by Stannis. Once, during the rebellion and later during the Greyjoy campaign, Ned had found a grudging respect for the man in front of him. Now he found nothing but pity. Pity, and a measure of contempt. Then what difference is there between you and the Mad King? The words seemed to strike Stannis dumb. He sat unmoving on his horse as his jaw worked mercilessly. Sir Davos looked sorrowfully at his lord as though he knew negotiation was now a forlorn hope. Still though, the loyal retainer rallied. His grace no longer burns his enemies, my lord. I need no excuses to be made on my behalf, Sir Davos, Stannis remarked abruptly, having regained his composure. I will not be judged by the likes of Lord Stark here. What I have done, I have done. I have no regrets. Doubtless Aerys Targaryen would have said much the same thing. Then you see why I cannot support your claim. Ned's voice was quiet but firm, nor encourage my son to do the same. I do not. Stannis said plainly. Ned's eyes flickered in surprise. You ask me to side with you against my son? My son? Surely a man who defied his lawful king for his brother can appreciate me doing the same for my son. Stannis's hand gripped the reins of his horse yet more tightly. The law clearly states. There are older laws, Ned shot back. And natural justice. If he was angry at having his own words thrown back at him, then Stannis gave no sign. Instead he merely clicked his tongue before muttering. Then we are done here. So be it. My lord, Sir Davos cried suddenly as Stannis made to head back to his lines, please hear me. These events you speak of are unfortunate, but the threat to the realm is real. He looked imploringly between his master and Ned. Surely it is our duty to put aside our animosity and face the real threat. A threat that I only have your word even exists, Ned observed. You believe I would lie, Stark? Stannis glowered. A man who kills his own brother, who commits his enemies to the flames, is capable of anything. If you doubt our word, then write to your son, my lord, Davos suggested quickly. He will tell you the truth of the matter. Jon. It was clear now what he had to do. He was not about to leave the north, nor Jon, to the mercy of Stannis Baratheon. The army at the wall must be dealt with, and the threat of incursion from beyond the wall had to be evaluated. Decided, Ned urged his horse to begin to turn back towards his lines. I will do more than that, Sir Davos. I will travel north with you. He looked back over his shoulder as he dug his heels into the horse's flank. Stannis and Davos were looking surprised at him. You're right. It is our duty to protect the wall. Such a business cannot be entrusted to a mere message. I wish to see this supposed threat for myself. Stannis mulled over this for a moment. Finally he nodded. Very well, Lord Stark, come to the wall and see the true enemy for what it is. Ned bowed his head before nudging his horse forwards. He looked south towards the large host he had assembled towards the west of Last Hearth. Indeed, I will go to the wall, but I won't be traveling alone. Chapter 78, Jon I. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Several thousand years ago. Her claw spread the substance on the wall. The odd sound of talons scratching against rock somewhat soothing as it scoured the cold stone surface. A whispered word of power accompanied the movement, the echo of the sounds vibrating around the enclosed space giving her incantation an even more magical feeling. The wall shimmered and suddenly the painting was set, etched deep into the deep stone crevice of the wall. There for eternity. The painter mused. Or at least as long as these caves endure. She sat back on her haunches to survey her work. Content with the pictures that met her eyes, she moved to another space of wall, its jagged surface forbidden and unwelcome. Or a blank canvas waiting for someone to transform it. As always it, like so much else, depended on how you saw it. Leaf. She did not turn to welcome the new arrival to the cave. This interloper into her own, private, work. There was no need to watch her fellow approach. Slowly, she dipped another claw into the paint and allowed her whole paw to submerge. The substance felt warm, cloying and yet comforting. She retracted her claw and let the yellow-red paint drip heavily back into an upturned seashell that served as a container. The soft padding of footfalls against stone alerted her that the intruder was getting closer. Clearly, he was not deterred by her lack of response. He must have been drawn by the torches she had lit to aid her work. Now that he had entered the cave, there was no way he could fail to see her. I knew it would have been better had I worked in darkness. Less chance of being discovered. Did you not hear me call you? The intruder had come to a halt a short distance below the outcrop of rocks on which she sat. The voice was angry now, irritated that he had been ignored. I did. Leaf replied, absent-mindedly, as she watched the paint swell in the seashell she'd dripped it into. The colored liquid mixed with the seawater that remained in the shell and diluted the rich texture. She watched it as she slowly rotated her wrist. Though I would point out that shouting in such an environment is unnecessary. You're wanted on the surface. The tone of her companion was full of anger and reproach. Am I? Leaf affected a bored tone. Now that we have agreed to unite with men in their fight against our enemy, I'd have thought our business here was concluded. She lifted her paw, watching the thick liquid pool through her fingers. It was a hypnotic sight. After all, what more is there to discuss? We must plan. Her companion sighed, his tongue clicking impatiently against the rows of pointed teeth inside his mouth. Even with our new alliance there is no guarantee of victory. The others are. I am well aware of what they are. Leaf cut him off firmly. I was there at their creation. You do not need to warn me of the danger they pose. And yet you and some of your party are here. Her colleague admonished her sternly. He cast his large slitted eyes about the cave. He looked disdainfully at the work of Leaf and the others who had done their own work before departing. Scribbling on walls. Events are important. Leaf reminded him, if we do not remember our past, how can we hope to avoid mistake in the future? Mistakes. Her friend scoffed, the sound amplified by the stone around them. He indicated the painting that Leaf had finished prior to the one she had just been working on. He shook his head in anger and not a little bit of despair. Is that what you call unleashing one of the most destructive forces we've ever seen on the world? Leaf bit back a reply, only nodding by way of response. It is. She spied that particular section of the painted wall with a tired eye. It showed a figure being tied to a tree and being made subject to a terrible spell, a spell conducted by another figure that bore a passing resemblance to Leaf herself. It was not one of her paintings. While she did not object to the painting but refused to draw it, letting others have that dubious honor. It was a terrible mistake. And one that I, regret beyond anything you could imagine. Regret, the intruder spat, for what you and your friends did you should be punished. We were sanctioned. Leaf reminded him, pushing away the feelings of bitterness that threatened to overwhelm her. We only did what we thought was right. A dark thought whispered from deep within her. What was necessary to save our world from those we thought would take it from us in their greed and avarice? We severed continents, we drowned lands, and yet the old enemy was implacable. They needed to be fought. How clever we thought we were to turn their own weapons against them, to use their own dead warriors as our tool. They could not fight the war themselves, so they would use others to do their work for them. A solution that had such a poetic nature to it had seemed too perfect to ignore. She quickly pushed away the thought. Arrogance. A voice whispered within her. Hubris. The irony of the situation almost made her give in to despair. We thought we were saving the world. Instead we are likely to have condemned it. Sanctioned. Her guest hissed ominously. I hardly find the decision by the elders to qualify as a sanction. You would have tended to the man, would you? Leaf asked, twisting her head to look at the figure below her. A human male, half dead from starvation and the cold. She remembered it as if it were but yesterday. The man breathing shallowly, his breath misting in the air of the cave as he was dragged towards them. He could barely speak through frozen lips as he recounted his tale of journeying north, the perils he had faced as his companions died one by one until he was the last. How he had almost succumbed himself until he had finished the first part of his quest and found the children of the forest. And there, beneath the great tree above them, half dead on the hard cave floor, the human had completed the second part of his mission. The eyes glittered angrily as her colleague took her in. If it were not for the abominations that you and your conspirators created, then the cold would not have been an issue. He's right there. Leaf realized. She hung her head. There was a logic to empowering the enemy so. Her mouth twisted mournfully. Mankind is affected by the elements in a way our people are not. How clever of you and your friends. Her companion remarked dryly. Though I'm sure you know that there are some who believe that your actions have doomed us all. And they could well be right. Leaf sighed, turning on the rock and spying her visitor in the light cast by the torches. She almost smiled at his startled face. You seem surprised. Did you think I would deny it? The intruder surveyed her, suddenly unsure of what to say. I. Leaf had had enough. In one graceful move she sprung from her place on the ledge and landed on the floor in front of the one who would intrude on her work. Why are you here? She demanded, allowing her eyes to narrow and her tone to become dangerous. To remonstrate with me over all my failings. My follies and errors. She grimaced. Better people than you have already done so, and their words were just as unnecessary. She turned and walked back to the cave wall, calling over her shoulder. Rest easy, I will not shirk my responsibilities. I will do whatever I must to correct our mistake. If that's true, then why do you waste time here? His voice accused. Instead of being on the surface above planning how to make amends for your crimes. We have done all we can here. Leaf told him. Now that an alliance has been made, we should return north to defend our home. There is still much to be decided. The other told her. Not for me. Leaf shrugged and sprung back onto the ledge to return to her work. She had hoped that her burst of action would have caused the irritant below to scurry away and leave her in peace. Unfortunately, he was not so easily dissuaded from his self-appointed mission. What more is to be done? Leaf muttered as she finally allowed her feelings of impatience and anger to bubble to the surface. We have made a pact with our old enemy to join forces and fight against the growing darkness. We have accomplished our task here. The intruder tutted at her in disbelief. We must plan. There is much work to be done. She felt his eyes boring into her. I would have thought that you, with your first-hand knowledge of the foe, would have understood how your insight in our discussions would be invaluable. You know all I know. Leaf retorted. I have told the story many times. There must be more. The voice shot back. Something you may have forgotten. That is why I paint. She answered, both as a reminder, a warning to the future, and to remember the horrific folly that led us to this place. There was silence below. For a moment Leaf thought he might have left, that her cryptic answer had sent him reeling from the room in anger and frustration, but then his voice echoed from beneath her once again. He is examining my fellow paintings, searching for clues. You believe the plan will work? He asked her. That imbuing the sword will be enough? Leaf shook her head. She understood the anxiousness of her kin, but she would not offer false assurances when she was anything but certain. It will depend on the heart of the man who wields it. She straightened and began her work afresh. The new picture started with a grey line that ended in a point. If he is valiant and stalwart, then we should be able to beat our enemy. There was movement below. Her colleague had retreated to the center of the cave. A quick glance found him gaping up at her with a look of confusion and fear upon his face. Is that all you have to say, Dot? Terror making his tone indignant. That we should be able to beat the enemy. Leaf sighed, feeling fatigue and regret suffuse her very bones. It tied her down almost as if she had the weight of the world on her shoulders. In many ways I do. There are no guarantees. She said simply. But this is our only hope. The voice was quiet now, as if fear has robbed it of its power, even the strength, to be outraged. No, she whispered as she returned to the shell of paint, once more gathering the fluid in her paw and spreading a red-yellow liquid about the grey line she had previously drawn. As she spread the paint, she was afforded a glimpse of the future. She saw it all, the terror, the death and the hope of what may come to pass. She spied the figure she had drawn to find that it now appeared to brandish an unfamiliar weapon. There is another. The present. The snowy ground was cold against his body. The ice seemingly embracing his prone form, leeching it of strength and leaving him defenseless. It was almost as if the cold yearned to drag him into the darkness. To swallow him as a great beast would helpless prey. Everything hurt. The agony from his injuries felt like red-hot pokers had been thrust into his flesh. His blood seeped through his clothes as the deep wounds gushed forth his life force onto the ground. He was weak and enfeebled, but he could still feel the pain keenly. That, it seemed in a cruel twist of fate, was undimmed by the numbing cold of the loss of blood. Is this what dying feels like? He did not see how it could be otherwise. The blades had struck deep into his body, driving the air from his lungs and laying him low on the floor. He had seen many men struck in a less severe manner than he had been and didn't see how he could survive the injuries inflicted upon him. Yet death did not find him totally unprepared. Being in the Night's Watch guaranteed that his life would be hard and perilous, the end always a potential heartbeat away. He had faced death many times north of the wall. Either from the cold or hunger, even the treacherous ascent of the wall itself. And that was not even mentioning the numerous wilding blades that he had encountered over the last 2 years, always keen, always eager to end the life of one of the hated crows. Gods, and then there was Hardham. All things considered, it was a miracle John had survived thus far. He had faced death numerous times in the last 2 years or more, and it wouldn't have been surprised if he had perished on any of those occasions. It would have been a purposeful death, guarding the realm, facing its enemies and doing his duty. Not so with this. Gods, there had been so many of them. He would that those that had attacked him had been some unknown assassins. Wildlings perhaps, or some of Stannis' men. That at least would have given him small consolation. But no, the gods had decided that his killers would not be strangers to Jon Snow, the 998th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Instead, fate had decreed that the men who would end his life would be his comrades, his friends, his brothers. The realization cut him deeper than the assassin's blades ever could. There was a tumult going on above him, there was screams and shouts, the sounds of battle filled the air. What the hell is going on? I was in the grounds of Castle Black. Safe, or so I thought. Have we been attacked? The thought sent a surge of fire through his gut. Duty compelled him to try and get to his feet, to help his loyal brothers repel the unseen force that was causing such consternation above him. He might be dying, true, but he was still Lord Commander. He would not allow his men to fight, and maybe die, while he lay here and did nothing. He could not do it. Try as he might, his body would not obey even the simple command to push himself to his knees. He could do nothing but lie where he was, his cheek pressed into the snow, his ever-receding breath melting the ice around his face and causing steam to rise weakly into the air. And yet his friends needed him. With one last effort, Jon got his hands under his body. With an almighty heave he pushed upwards. A wave of agony passed through him, his actions accompanied by more of his life's blood pulsing onto the snow-covered dirt. For a moment he thought he had succeeded in pushing himself to his knees. If he could only do that, then he just had to gather his legs under him and he'd be back on his feet. To his dismay, he realized that his efforts had only achieved the paltry task of pushing himself onto his side. He was still lying on the cold ground of the courtyard looking across at the mess hall. It was a pitiful attempt, but it was enough to afford Jon a view of the melee that had broken out amongst the inhabitants of Castle Black. The sight that greeted him was enough to make him want to give up and collapse back onto his front once again. Everywhere was chaos. Members of the Night's Watch fought wildlings and armored men at the same time. Men were throwing themselves into the fray with wild abandon. The ring of clashing swords rang out across the courtyard, and the shouts of angry men drew more and more men into the fray. The wildlings seemed to be being led by Tormund Giantsbane, his massive head of red hair streaming behind him as he set into the men of the Watch who were bearing his path towards where Jon lay. The Watch was being supported by men wearing the colors of Stannis Baratheon. They had joined ranks and were trying to aid the Watch in forcing the wildlings back. They had tried to form a shield wall, but they had not yet been successful. Here and there some wilderling warriors had broken through the ranks and engaged the heavily armored soldiers at close quarters. Treachery! A woman's voice screeched from somewhere behind John. Treachery! No. John wanted to shout, but his lungs failed him. It wasn't the wildlings who attacked me. The shouts from the woman somewhere on the ramparts above him seemed to spur the men on to greater violence. John saw a wilderling who had fought next to him at Hardham take a sword to the side, the knight's castle forged steel making short work of the protection offered by the man's rough weather-damaged furs. The man grit his teeth in pained surprise as the blade opened up a mortal wound, but still he had the presence of mind to ram the knife clutched in his gloved fist, a simple piece of jagged metal with a bone-like handle, into his killer's unprotected throat. He whipped his weapon to the side, exiting the other man's neck in a spray of blood. The knight gagged and clawed at his throat as his blood poured as though from a burst wineskin onto the snow. The wilderling took a moment's satisfaction to smile painfully before he too fell to the ground, vainly trying to staunch the wound that was soon to claim him. 2 men dead. John realized with regret and shame as the battle continued. A southern knight and a wilderling, killed in the time it took to think it. And they were not alone. All over the courtyard the fighting was taking a heavy toll on each side. Warriors lay injured and dying all around them. John could not fathom it. What is going on? He tried to think, but his mind could not wrap his head around events. He could only lie there helpless. Maybe it was the cold, maybe it was the sight of friends and allies taking up arms against the other, maybe it was simply the fact that he was dying and all his life's choices had seemingly led him to this point. Whatever the case, John felt his mind clouded by thoughts of the past. It started with my decision to join the Watch. John reflected as he made his hand grip one of the several deep wounds in his chest. With a small cry of pain he seized the sundered flesh and forced it together along with a wad of material from his ruined jerkin. He prayed it would stop the bleeding, at least buy him some time. Though for what he wasn't sure, even a cursory glance told him his wounds were beyond Maester Eamon's skills as a healer. As he gripped his stomach and chest as tightly as he could, John considered, not for the first time, that joining the Night's Watch might not have been the best move. But then, it had felt like the right decision at the time. A choice that had given him the chance, perhaps his only chance, to escape the circumstances of his birth and forge his own place in the world. This desire had begun to grow when he was but a boy, John knew. Back when he was raised alongside Robb Stark within the stout imposing walls of Winterfell. He had known from his first memory that he was different, set apart from the brown-haired boy who was, to all other purposes, his brother. It had not taken long for the intelligent youngster to realize that it was because he was illegitimate that he was set apart. The servants reacted differently to him. Treating him, always with respect, but with standoffishness that he became more and more aware of as he grew into adolescence. He and Robb remained close, but he was forever aware that his sibling was the heir to Winterfell. He was not a bastard, not a Stark but a Snow. There were times when it did not bother him. Eddard Stark openly acknowledged John as his son. He made no attempt to hide his love for his children and treated them all the same. He played with them, encouraged and loved them. Indeed, it was these small tender moments, when his father took him riding, watching with obvious pride as John bested an opponent in the training yard, or when he simply played with Robb and Arya in the grounds of the Godswood, that he felt as though he was accepted. That he was one of the family. But there was a cost to such moments, and always to do with Lady Catelyn. Lady Stark was as cold to him as a northern snow. She never beat him, never scolded him. Truth to tell, she often ensured that if John was at a place, she was someone else. But he was never less than certain of the fact that though Lord Eddard Stark was his father, Lady Stark was defiantly not his mother. The Lady of Winterfell could not stand him, did not want him there. If it was within her power, then she would send him away. This much was clear. When John reached the age of 10, there had been a rumor, no more than that, which said Lady Stark had openly expressed a desire to send him away from Winterfell. That she intended to have her lord husband foster his bastard son with a loyal bannerman who, doubtlessly, would be only too happy to have a son of their liege lord under their roof. Rumors started that perhaps the Glovers would take him, or maybe the Karstarks. There was even mutterings of his staying at White Harbor with the Marndalis, whose loyalty to House Stark was unquestioned. It was a suitable compromise, John supposed, one that allowed Eddard Stark's son to be raised with nobility without his presence being a continual source of humiliation to Lady Stark. Rumor has it that the Lady of Winterfell was pushing hard for this to be done. However, Catelyn was to find that, as much as her husband loved her, on this subject he was unmovable. One day, having found he could bear the rumors no longer, John went to talk to his father. He had stumbled upon Lord Eddard and his adoptive mother arguing over the very issue he was there to talk about. Anxious not be caught eavesdropping, he had hidden behind a large tapestry set in an alcove at the entrance to the room occupied by his father. It had seemed like an absurd hiding place, but, despite him sweating in fear of discovery behind the heavy fabric, John would be ever glad that he had been in position to listen to the conversation. "My answer is no." John had let out a breath at his father's declaration. He felt the warmth in his cheek as he practically glowed with pride and gratitude as his father rejected his wife's entreaties. "He is my blood cat. He belongs in Winterfell. You can argue until winter comes, and the others rise again, but I will never send him away." "And what of the rest of the family?" Catelyn had protested. Oh, how John had hated her then. "What of Robb, Sansa, Arya and the babe I carry? Do you not think of them? John is family," his father had insisted. "He is close to Robb and will be to Sansa and Arya as well, given time. They have no concept of the dishonor you say I bring upon them." "Then what of me?" Catelyn's eyes blazed fiercely. "Why must you dishonor me so by parading him alongside your lawful children?" For the fraction of an instant a sorrowful expression crossed Ned Stark's face, a look of haunted regret whose meaning was beyond Jon's youthful mind. He watched from the corner of the tapestry as Ned hung his head. For a terrifying moment the hiding child feared his father might submit to his wife's pleas. However, in the next instant the look was gone, replaced with the ice-cold face of the Lord of Winterfell. "The boy stays," Father had said with grim finality. "He is one of the pack, and the pack survives best when it is together." Catelyn had bristled. "He is not one of us." Ned's head snapped up, his face had hardened, any compassion dispelled at his wife's words. "He is. And that is my last word on the subject." Just like that, the rumors ceased. The Lord of Winterfell had spoken and that was the end of the matter. Even Catelyn Stark was not bold enough to defy her husband. Whilst John was happy that he had not been sent away, his feelings of discontentment grew as time went by. While he loved his siblings, particularly Robb and Arya, he was struck by the nature of his birth, how he was different from the others. It gnawed at him. A constant ache from which he could get no relief, even though at first it had been a small thing, not unlike a flea bite but one that grew into a festering sore. As he grew older, he saw more looks, detected the hushed comments as he walked by. The conclusion was undeniable. "You are a bastard." He had oft reminded himself, as if he needed reminding. "And that is all you will ever be." That reality was further brought home to him when King Robert and his party visited Winterfell upon the death of Jon Arryn and the king's decision to ask Lord Stark to assume his foster father's place as Hand of the King. Jon had been forbidden by Lady Catelyn to sit with the rest of the family during the feast and instead was placed at the back of the hall. Not for the first time it was made clear to him that he was not one of the family. He could sit and observe along with the servants and entertainers but never be one of the highborn. He hadn't felt as angry or bereft of his place in the world since the time he had gone to the family crypts with Robb, Arya and Bran. What had started as a fun day of japes and scares had been sullied when Jon had been reminded that he would never be buried there. He was not a Stark and had no place in their ancestral tombs. The thought left a burning anger and resentment. A series of feelings that had flared up once again on the night of the feast. Feelings that, if truth be told, had not been helped by his encounter with Tyrion Lannister in the training yard. The imp, so drunk he could barely stand, but yet still with enough wits to point out Jon's status with a blunt disregard for his feelings. Though, even then the dwarf had offered a good piece of advice: never forget what you are. The imp had told him with a wistful smile. The rest of the world will not. Wear it like armor and it can never be used to hurt you. As he had mulled over this thought they had been interrupted by the arrival of Benjen Stark as he rode in for the feast. The first ranger of the Night's Watch, and Jon's uncle had galloped into the courtyard like the man of action that Jon had taken him to be. The Night's Watch. Jon had considered, long considered stretching back as far as he could remember, plans and feelings coalescing into a blinding light of realization. As he looked at the heroic figure of his uncle, he made an instant decision. Before he knew it, he had walked forward and boldly asked to be allowed to join the Night's Watch. It was not the first time he had asked, indeed he had argued vehemently with his father on the subject. But this time he was adamant. He wanted to leave, wanted to go somewhere that would take him on merit, not on birth. It was the only time he had argued with his beloved uncle. Benjen Stark had tried to be kind. Tried to put him off by saying that Jon was too young to be joining the Watch, though, of course, he'd be welcomed if he was a little older. Benjen Stark had said that the sacrifices required were high, perhaps too high for a boy who had not yet experienced the world, to know what he suggesting he give up if he joined those at the Wall. Jon had stood his ground and argued that it was his right to join the Watch should he so wish. Uncle Benjen had ended the conversation saying he would consider it. While hardly the words that Jon had wanted to hear, it had been enough to allow his uncle to leave for the feast taking place inside the castle. Evidently though, Uncle Benjen had kept his word and had sought counsel with Mayor Stillowin, informing him of Jon's wishes and asking how to proceed. By good or bad luck, depending on your perspective, this had coincided with King Robert appointing Ned Stark as the replacement for Jon Arryn as Hand of the King. Lord Stark decided to accept the appointment and resolved to leave Winterfell and head south with his friend. It was made clear to Jon that staying at Winterfell was no longer an option. Catelyn Stark might be willing to suffer his presence as long as Lord Eddard ruled, but, in his absence, it was obvious that Jon was not welcome to remain in the castle he had considered home since he had been old enough to walk. Also, for some reason Jon could not fathom, Lord Eddard would not even consider taking him to the capital. His enquiries on the subject, tentative though they might have been, were roundly rebuffed without a second thought. Once, some time ago, Jon had harbored a hope that his position as a son of Eddard Stark might have been enough to have him appointed as Lord of a Holdfast, a small keep that he might be able to command in his father's name. Sadly, Jon knew he was currently too young for such an appointment. He was simply out of time and out of options. He would no longer have a place in Winterfell and yet could not go south with his father. Jon had considered asking to be fostered by one of his father's houses or even of striking out on his own. But the first option would simply swap one household looks for that of another. There was also the burning ambition he had to make a mark on the world, to be someone in spite of his birth. He doubted very much that he could do so completely on his own without name or coin. The Night's Watch, it seemed, was to be his destiny. This time, when he enquired, he found he was pushing against an open door. Both his uncle and Mayor Stillowin had spoken to Lord Stark on his behalf, and though he seemed reluctant, Jon's father allowed him to make the decision to join the Watch. It had been a heartbreaking decision to say goodbye to Arya and Robb. Others of course were more welcoming of his departure. Jon was acutely aware that, by joining the Night's Watch, he surrendered all claims to land and titles. He suspected that Lady Catelyn would be delighted by this turn of events. Not only would he be gone from her sight, but he would cease to be a threat to Lord Eddard's legitimate children. And so it was that after preparations were made, a process only delayed following Bran's tragic accident whilst climbing a tower that saw Jon leave Winterfell the same day as his father had with Robert Baratheon. The king has headed south for King's Landing while he journeyed north to the Wall. The Wall, Jon reflected as his blood flowed through his fingers, had been nothing but a series of disappointments. His first misgivings came when he saw the ragtag band of murderers, thieves and rapists that formed the group that accompanied him to the Wall. The vagabond known as Yoren, though a sworn brother of the Watch himself, looked unkempt, practically a beggar himself. He was little more than a waif rather than a stalwart knight who protected the realm. And he was the best presented of the group. The rest of the recruits were urchins who were fleeing a more final fate in the south and had opted for service on the Wall as the only way to save their skin. For a boy raised to believe in the nobility of the Watch's mission and the bravery and stoicism of its members, it was a cruel blow. Things had not improved upon his arrival. Despite excelling at weapons drills, Jon's prowess was not acknowledged by anyone. He wasn't even permitted to become a ranger. Alistair Thorne, Castle Black's surly master-at-arms, had seen to that in a petty act of spite. Instead, he had been assigned to Lord Commander Mormont as his personal steward, an appointment that struck Jon as nothing less than an insult. In Jon's mind, the only job worth having in the Night's Watch was that of a ranger. Anything else was a waste of potential. I can fight better than any of the recruits, probably than most of the others. And yet I must fetch and carry for the Lord Commander. Wisdom had come in the round form of Samuel Tully, a fellow recruit who had been forced to come to the Night's Watch by his family. It was he who had impressed upon John the advantages of being the Lord Commander's steward. That Gia Mormont, the old bear himself, was preparing him for command one day. It had left a bitter taste, but John accepted his lot. Slowly, he began to adapt to life on the wall. He made friends with some of the other new arrivals, sharing his own skills with a blade and offering to help others less fortunate in their training. It took time, but eventually he was accepted by his fellow recruits. Young men that were dying around him now. John tried once again to lift himself, but it was no use. His body stubbornly refused to obey his commands. He could only lay there, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried to make his tortured lungs function. Yes, he had begun to feel a bit more content on the wall until the fateful day when the hammer of fate had seemed to fall multiple times to jar him from any thought of complacency. On the day that John said his vows before the weirwood tree north of the wall, the bodies of 2 rangers had been uncovered by Ghost. The 2 were last known to have journeyed beyond the wall under the command of Benjen Stark, who had not been seen nor heard from since he had left Castle Black. John and his new brothers returned the corpses to Castle Black only to find that the Lord Commander had news of his own. A raven had reported that King Robert was dead and that Lord Eddard Stark had been arrested on charges of treason after apparently trying to usurp the throne. Sir Alistair, who possessed a long-held grudge against Ned Stark, was the first to gloat over the situation. John had lost his temper and attacked the man, a rash action that caused him to be put in isolation while the Lord Commander considered how best to punish him. However, soon the Lord Commander had more important concerns than dealing with a brawl between brothers. That very night one of the corpses that had been brought through the wall came to life, though if it remembered its former life those memories had been suppressed. The undead creature attacked Gia Mormont in his own chambers. It was only the timely interruption of John that saved the old warrior's life. John had used fire to return the corpse to the grave. Though only when the dead man's body had been totally consumed by the flames did the attack cease. As a reward for John saving his life, Mormont gifted to him his family's ancestral sword, Longclaw. The blade was comprised of Valyrian steel and John constantly marveled at the quality of the weapon. The event caused a sea change amongst the Night's Watch, almost as if it had shaken off the shackles of its former lethargy. This was not the first time that members of the Watch had had reports of creatures such as the one that Flowers had become. Faced with a threat of unknown origin and strength, Gia Mormont had ordered the Watch to assemble and strike out north, beyond the wall and into the lands of the wildlings to find the source of the threat and find the missing members of their organization. It was a bold move and one that did not meet with unanimous support, but yet the Lord Commander was obeyed and the Watch made preparations for the great ranging. John had been excited by the prospect of journeying north. Of actually doing something as opposed to waiting for events to overtake him. He had been torn, however, when word reached Castle Black that John's brother Robb had called the Northern Banners and marched south to save their father from the cells under the Red Keep. To help one's family or keep a sacred vow made before a heart tree. The choice was an excruciating one. It was only a conversation with Maester Aemon and the actions of John's fellow brothers, Sam, Pyp and Gren, that prevented him from deserting the Watch and riding to assist Robb. The next day Mormont had chastised him for thinking of running and extracted a promise from John that he was committed to the Watch and its goals. John had given his word, accepting his place as the Lord Commander's squire. He had just enough time to have Longclaw's pommel engraved into the shape of a direwolf before taking his place amongst the Night's Watch as it sent a host ranging to the north. In the present, an arrow whistled overhead, a muted cry responded as the barb struck home in some poor soul. John tried to see who the victim was, but he couldn't make his head turn enough to see. The cold had now numbing his face and neck. He could barely even feel his fingers. Though of course, he was used to cold by now. The weather north of the wall had been nothing short of atrocious. As bad as the conditions had been at Castle Black, it had seemed like nothing compared with the desolate wasteland that the wildlings called home. The cold was biting, the terrain harsh and treacherous. Food was scarce, with foraging parties often coming up empty-handed. In some ways the rolling plains and threadbare woods would have been inviting were it not for the constant threat of death. There was the ever-present fear of an imminent wilderling attack, or that some icy ground would give way and drop any of them into a chasm or some deep pool of water where they would freeze to death before anyone would be able to save them. In short, the terrain offered as many ways to kill them as the enemy who stalked these lands. John had almost been grateful when they had arrived at the scant shelter offered by Craster's keep. Daughter fucking bastard the wilderling may have been, but he was known as a friend to the Watch, or at least not openly hostile to them. All that the weary men cared about when they arrived at his door was that the man had a roof over his head and a fire in his hearth. While many in the Night's Watch were appalled at Craster's lifestyle, it was stunning how quickly a man's scruples gave way when faced with numb hands, frozen feet and an empty belly. They had stayed there a while, sending out patrols and scouring the surrounding land. They had found nothing. All wilding camps nearby had been abandoned with nary a sign of life. There was also no indication of Benjen's group. There was nothing to tell what was going on in the lands, and Craster was not forthcoming if he knew anything to tell. The keep's household was made up of Craster and his daughter wives. Mormont ordered the men to let their hosts be. Faced with either the cold steel of Craster's axe or exile from the warmth of his fire, the men reluctantly obeyed. Samwell Tarly couldn't help himself, of course. Despite orders, the fat brother made friends with a girl named Jilly who was close to giving birth, Craster's progeny child and grandchild both. Sam had implored John to help the girl, almost crying at the prospect of leaving the youngster to her fate at the hands of her father-husband. Faced with the pleas of one of his best friends on the wall, John had ached to help, but he was unable to think of a way around Mormont's edict. There was simply no way they could take the girl and child with them. It was brutally unfair, and it rankled John something fierce and soured his already poor mood. He was not alone. Almost every man who was part of the Great Ranging was affected by their ongoing mission. The whole endeavor was quickly appearing to be pointless, with the hunger, the cold and miserable conditions, which they were subjected to on a daily basis, causing tempers to fray and attitudes to deteriorate. But then it happened, a vision of the enemy was given to him, and all John's previous complaints slipped away like so much inconsequential mist. One night John had been woken by a sound to see Craster slipping across the boundary of his keep with something swaddled in his arms. John was intrigued and followed the wilderling into the surrounding woods. A short while later the man lay down his burden and then stepped away, retracing his steps back to shelter and a warm fire. John debated what to do from his hiding place as the wilderling stomped past the trees, obscuring him for view. His mind was made up as he heard a child's cry, weak and reedy, coming from the bundle left behind by Craster. John had started forward, but then something had stopped him. The cold hit him first, a deep shiver that went through his clothes and froze him to the core. The cold was followed by an eerie silence, as if the surrounding trees themselves feared making a sound. Slowly a thin figure with blue eyes and skeletal white frame emerged from the night and took the crying infant with them into the trees. The retrieval was so sudden, John would later wonder if he had imagined it. John had been paralyzed with indecision and, before he could act, the figure was gone into the night, leaving barely an imprint in the heavy snow. He had rushed through the woods in the direction the creature had left, but he found his chase to be futile. The kidnapper was gone as suddenly as it had arrived, along with the infant it had been left by Craster. John searched the woods, but the tracks were gone with nary a sign that the being had been there in the first place. Later, wrapped in a threadbare blanket attempting to sleep, John had given the moment a great deal of thought. What he had seen was not a man. No living breathing creature would be out of doors wearing no furs nor armor. Not only had the creature seemed impervious to cold, but it had moved with undeniable grace and poise like a human, yet clearly not. And the eyes. God's the eyes. Deep blue pools of light that glowed with an ethereal power and yet cold and dark. Remote and otherworldly. In the nights since then the answer had come to him as to what the creature was. A creature that moved like a human and yet was clearly not. The consideration of all these facts could only lead to one end. What John had seen could only have been another, a White Walker. The conclusion was a disquieting one. A creature from legend long thought extinct, if it had ever existed at all, real and tangible. As corporeal a being as John had ever seen. He had no time to dwell on it. Within a day the Great Ranging was on the move to the Fist of the First Men, a defendable location once used if legend could be believed, and John was no longer certain that such things were mere myth, by warriors against the others. As they had begun to secure the site and prepare its defenses, John's direwolf, Ghost, led his master to a mound of tough ground where it proceeded to dig up an old war horn and a cache of what Sam revealed was a substance known as dragon glass that had been wrapped in an old cloak of the Night's Watch. It was a curious find. However, once again, events had raced ahead of John's ability to properly rationalize them. Thorin Halfhand, a leader of the Watch members posted to the Shadow Tower, arrived on the Fist. Thorin was so named from an old injury that had left him maimed. For reasons beyond John, the veteran ranger handpicked him to accompany one of the parties that was being dispatched to scout into the surrounding mountains. Dedicated to fulfilling his duty, John had pushed recent events aside and threw himself into the task at hand. A good thing too, as several days into their mission, Thorin's party happened upon a group of wildling sentries. A small skirmish ensued that ceased when all the scouts were killed, all apart from a wildling woman. The woman called herself Ygritte. Ygritte. A wave of pain hit him, and John grimaced again as he looked out at the courtyard beyond the point at which he lay. The fighting ahead had become more intense. With a sudden roar, the wildlings surged forward to throw themselves once more onto the thin shield wall that had been set up in front of John, preventing the wildlings from getting to him. At the sudden rush, the ring of steel broke abruptly, with thin gaps opening up across the line. The fighting became more frantic and chaotic. The fight spilled out into a series of skirmishes. Even more men fell in the chaos. "Stop!" John wanted to shout. "Stand down!" But breath was denied to him. It was hard enough to maintain consciousness, much less order anything. Another man went down with an agonized cry. The body was close enough for John to observe the life leave the man's eyes. "That will be me soon enough." He had never felt so powerless. Well, that was not entirely true. He had come close before. Faced with a captive woman before him, John had found himself unable to follow the half-hand's orders and kill Ygritte. Instead, he quietly released her into the White Wastes, hopeful that by the time she returned to her people and betrayed the Watch's position, they would have moved on. John's group decided to return to the Fist of the First Men. They sent men ahead and left one or two behind to forestall pursuit. Unfortunately, they did not move fast enough and were captured by a group of wildlings led by a fearsome wretch by the name of Rattleshirt. Still, the moment had been prepared for. Talks with the woman Ygritte before her release had confirmed the rumors that Mance Rayder, a former member of the Night's Watch, was the leader of a wildling army that had been gathered by uniting the distinct tribes in a singular cause. Further questioning showed that the wildlings were intent on breaching the wall and striking south into the lands beyond the barrier that stretched from coast to coast. The exodus from their homeland appeared to spring from their fear of an upcoming threat which they had no hope of defeating. Given what John had seen, what was here in the far north, John couldn't exactly say that he blamed them. As the prospect of capture became more real, Thorn and John had spoken about what to do next. The veteran ranger had turned to John and instructed him to join the wildlings, pretending to turn his coat in the name of infiltrating the enemy army and, perhaps, getting close to Mance Rayder himself. John understood that, if the opportunity present itself, he should attempt to assassinate the former ranger and hope that by so doing, the army Mance had assembled would fragment back into its distinct tribes and factions. The half-hand ordered John to do whatever the wildlings asked so that he could provide proof of his change in loyalty. The price was high indeed, Thorin Halfhand's death. Their order completed and the half-hand's corpse bleeding onto the frozen ground, the wildlings determined to take John to where their army was encamped. It was there, amongst the numerous warriors, odd animals and even giants, that John first met Mance Rayder. The lean man who was hailed as the king beyond the wall was a charismatic individual who explained to John that he had indeed united the disparate wildling groups together so that they could form an overwhelming force who intended to attack the wall, storm Castle Black, and escape to the relative safety of the south. Mance took some convincing, but he eventually believed in John's desertion from the Watch. It helped John's cause that he had seen the enemy the wildlings faced, and the haunting look that crossed his face convinced the wildlings that he spoke the truth. That being said, Rayder determined not to keep John close and instead assigned him to a wildling unit whose mission was to travel to a part of the wall that was poorly patrolled and then scale it. The group planned to circle round to attack Castle Black from the south, whilst Mance would lead the bulk of the army against the wall from the north. The Watch would be hopelessly outnumbered and attacked on both sides. There was not a possibility of repelling the attack if they were not pre-warned. Alone on his trek to climb the wall, Jon resolved to provide that warning. The roar of a warrior returned Jon to the present. From his place on the cold ground he saw the mighty figure of Tormund Giantsbane throw himself upon the ranks of armored soldiers that had started to reassemble on one side of the tourney yard and setting their large shields in front of themselves. The large wildling smashed into the reforming shield wall and he used his muscled bulk to send the men reeling backwards. Taking their lead from the fierce warrior, the other wildlings followed suit and, within seconds, the ordered shield wall had become nothing more than routed melee of soldiers and knights who fled backwards. The large wildling set about him. His large sword, another clump of sharp metal that was lethal enough to give the most armored soldier pause, cut into the enemy on left and right, causing the members of the Night's Watch and Baratheon troops alike to fall back in disarray. From his vantage point, Jon could appreciate the warrior's skill and ferocity. Formal training he doesn't have, but he is no less deadly for all that. It had been Tormund Giantsbane who led the party to scale the wall. The party was a motley gang of fierce fighters and scouts that just happened to include the former captive girl Ygritte. On their journey towards the wall, Jon became reacquainted with the young woman and their relationship blossomed. Bloomed in fact to the point of breaking his vow of chastity with her in a secreted cave while they bathed in a hot spring. It was as perfect a moment as Jon had ever had. And he wished now it had never happened. It made thoughts of what came later too painful. During the traitorous climb, Jon had thought long and hard about where his loyalties had lain. Despite the freedom and happiness he thought he might enjoy with the wildlings, he found that, no matter how hard he tried, he could not shake the feeling that, should his betrayal become reality, he would be condemning all those at Castle Black to death and the lands of the north to the ravages of conquest. He was a brother of the Night's Watch, a poor one given what he had done with Ygritte, but a sworn brother nonetheless. In the end he had vowed his life to their service and he found he could not turn on them. His course was clear: he must escape the party of wildlings and warn his brothers of the upcoming attack on their headquarters. Jon's chance to do that came sooner than he had expected. As they picked their way across the tough terrain towards the rear of Castle Black, they scouted a farm whose purpose seemed to be to provide horses for the Night's Watch. Suddenly the group was attacked by a large wolf. In the confusion, Jon slipped away from the group as they tangled with the wild beast. He almost made it away cleanly, but several wildlings, having detected his intention, loosed arrows at him. Most missed their target, but one did not. An arrow pierced his leg as he clambered onto one of the nearby horses, but he grit his teeth against the pain and rode hard for Castle Black. To think back then, I felt like I was coming home. A safe place in a world of coldness and pain. Well, safer than most other places at any rate. Now, he was going to die here. Betrayed by those he thought were friends. Jon's blood continued to seep from him. He could no longer muster the strength to try and stanch the wounds that were killing him. Breathing was becoming an even bigger effort than it had been before. Aware that his time was short, Jon forced himself to look up and search the training ground ahead of him. His brothers were dying all around the courtyard. The least he owed them was to look at them as they fought the traitors who had done this to him. I wish they had killed me when I returned from my mission with the wildlings. His return to Castle Black was not one of celebration. He was met by suspicion and weariness by the small number of brothers who had been left behind when the Lord Commander had led his great ranging north of the wall. They had not had word of their brothers since the host disappeared into the frozen wastes, and now one of their number had returned, insensate from pain, malnutrition and the cold. Jon had been tended to by Maester Aemon. The blind Maester worked diligently on his wound, using his decades of experience as the principal healer of Castle Black to heal Jon's injury. As soon as he was able, Jon warned the Watch about Mance Rayder and the advancing wildling army from both the north and, more importantly, to the rear. Ravens were sent that very night from Castle Black to all the houses of the north, pleading for military aid in repelling the upcoming invasion. I fear it will be in vain, Aemon has said in a tired voice when he returned from dispatching the messages. It is highly doubtful that the houses will be in a position to send us help given what we know of their situation. It was then that Jon had learnt of recent events. The north had been invaded already, this time from the south. The Ironborn had used the Stark's war with the Lannisters as a distraction to mount their own campaign of conquest. Winterfell had fallen. Jon's home as a child was now occupied by Theon Greyjoy, who had betrayed his oath to Robb Stark and taken the castle where he had been raised as a ward. Jon had never liked Theon, The man was arrogant, conceited and bitter. Even as children the two had never gotten along. But Robb had trusted him, a trust that turned out to have been misplaced. Worse news was to follow. Reports indicated that, in taking Winterfell, Theon had executed Bran and Rickon. With the rest of the Stark family somewhere in the south, some of the houses, the Boltons and Dustins in particular, had risen in revolt. Robb was now trapped between Ironborn and the Boltons in the north and the Lannisters in the south. Assuming of course that he was even still alive. They had no news on that score. A day or two later they would receive even further word in the form of Grenn, who came stumbling through the northern snow along with several other brothers. The news he gave was some of the direst yet. Lord Commander Mormont's host had been attacked and defeated on the Fist of the First Men. Attacked by undead wights and something, far, far worse. The force of Night's Watchmen had been utterly defeated and broken. According to Grenn's account, the Watch was no match for the dead beings who faced them, and the host took heavy losses before the survivors were sent fleeing back to Craster's Keep for warmth and food. Once again Jon was brought face to face with the fact that the Walkers existed and were extremely hostile to living things. However, while they had successfully found refuge, there was no safety to be found, though this time the danger the Watch came from within its own ranks. Some of their best men were lost upon the Fist and the survivors were demoralized, hungry and scared. When Craster, never a liked man among the brothers to start with, refused to share food with the Watch, the atmosphere had become poisonous, the men rebellious. It took but the wrong word to turn some of the remaining Watch to tilt to full-blown mutiny. A skirmish had broken out as the brothers turned on their host, first killing Craster and then turning on those that followed Mormont's orders to stand fast. Brother turned on brother in a frenzy of blood-alting. When the fight was over, Mormont was dead and Grenn and his fellow loyalists were sent running into the forest, plunging south to seek refuge. Grenn and his small party were exhausted, and although they carried heavy news, they were at least able to confirm Jon's story that a huge wildling force was on its way south to the wall. That confirmed at least part of Jon's story, yet it gave him no relief from the overwhelming feelings of guilt. While he had been pretending with the wildlings, the Lord Commander had been killed. Both he and several dozen loyalists, some of whom were Jon's own friends, had been cut down by those they thought were brothers. It would have been enough to cast Jon into a dark depression, but there was not enough time to consider the importance of the information he had been given. Scant hours after he had been told the news of the Lord Commander's losses, the horns of Castle Black let forth a warning tone. Tormund's raiding party had sacked Molestown and set the village on fire. Clearly, they had decided to forego the plan to launch a dual attack in concert with Manst's army and instead had opted to launch their attack early, presumably because of Jon's return to the castle and the warning he would give to the Watch. An early attack would help forego the chances of the Watch being able to prepare themselves. They were very nearly right. Putting aside his personal troubles, Jon raced to help Donal Noyce, the Watch's blacksmith who had assumed command of Castle Black's defense. He mained the castle ramparts and rained arrow fire down on the wildlings as they advanced. The fighting was bitter and hard, the wildlings having the advantage of numbers, but the defenders' walls were high, their resolve stiffened by the knowledge that surrender or defeat could only mean their deaths. The battle lasted 4 days, with the sun rising and setting as the fight ebbed and flowed. Though many were killed, including Jon's friends, Grenn and Pyp as well as Donal Noyce himself, the defenses held, and the raiding party finally broken, with the vast majority of the enemy either dead trying to gain entry or brought down just within the castle walls. Tormund himself was captured as he was surrounded by the enemy and overwhelmed. As Jon had searched the dead and dying, he came across the body of Ygritte, his former love, mortally wounded from an arrow that had pierced her very near the heart. He held her in his arms, listened to her last words and felt the life leave her eyes. Something deep within himself died as well that day. And now he was, his wish given form. Here, now. For the crime of doing what he thought was right. An ear-splitting scream caught his ear. Jon managed to turn his head as a wildling warrior slammed his short sword, in truth nothing more than another jagged piece of rusted metal, into the stomach of a Baratheon footman who had not had time to put on his armor before being roused to the fight. The wildling abandoned his weapon in the body of the man who he had just killed and let the man fall to the floor still screaming. The wildling paid him no mind as he hurled himself, unarmed, into the brutal melee. So brave, Jon thought. Tough brutal people, in a tough brutal world. When the dawn of the fourth day after the battle broke, John burnt Ygritte's body just north of the wall, ensuring that she would not return the way Jaffa Flowers had. Taking her body into the homeland of the wildlings before he had committed her body to the flames was as close as John could get to what he knew Ygritte would have wanted. She was the last casualty to be burnt. His head was bowed as her body left the world. He wanted no one to see his pain. He stayed there until the small pyre was nothing but ashes before he walked slowly back the way he had come. His return to Castle Black coincided with the arrival of a group of watchmen from Eastwatch by the sea. In any other circumstances John would have been welcomed reinforcements, even if the number was ridiculously small compared to the Watch's recent losses. The group was led by Sir Alistair Thorne. The Master-at-Arms had missed the Great Ranging on account of being sent south to present himself before the Iron Throne and request support in countering the threats beyond the wall. This mission had apparently been met with scant success. Thorne had been sent packing with no assistance being offered by the Iron Throne beyond a group of new recruits from the cells beneath the Red Keep as well as any undesirables that were no longer wanted in the capital. One of these happened to be Janos Slynt, the former commander of the City Watch who had, for reasons unknown, appeared to have been sentenced to exile on the wall. Not that that seemed to dampen the man's belief in himself and his right to command. Slynt and Thorne had quickly taken charge of the remainders of the Night's Watch and ordered John's arrest on the charge of treason. He was consigned to an ice cell where he waited for the better part of a fortnight before being dragged before an impromptu tribunal to hear the evidence against him. There was plenty to present. By his own admission, John had killed the half-hand and joined the wildlings on their journey to cross the wall. He had broken his vows with a wilderling woman. He was guilty, and would have been hung were it not for the intercession of Maester Aemon, who vouched for John's honor and spoke of his valor in defending Castle Black against the wilderling attack. The blind Maester was well respected amongst the Watch, and his words of support presented Thorne and Slynt with a problem. John had earned a great deal of popularity for his actions during the battle with the wildlings, and that, coupled with Aemon's support, made executing him very difficult, yet neither man wanted to free him. Unfortunately, a solution to their dilemma presented itself in the form of Mance Rayder. At the sounds of horns, the Watch manned the defenses and looked out at the massive host brought to their walls. As John and his brothers watched, the army presented itself in front of the wall as if for inspection. There seemed to be no end to the enemy numbers. Thousands of wilderling warriors emerged from the haunted forest and lined up just outside of arrow range. Morale plummeted among the Watch as they saw the seemingly endless horde continue to pour from the trees. There had been giants among them. Tall hulking brutes. John had seen several during his short stay in Mance's camp. But to many of his brothers this added to the feelings of despair that spread among those that were sworn to protect the wall. Yet as they arrived, the enemy drew to a halt, staring back at the paltry Night's Watch force that looked down from the height of the wall. The free folk waited, seemingly in no hurry to launch an attack on the wall and lose men in a battle that was pointless. There was no way, with all the valor in the world, that the Night's Watch could win this fight. They all knew it. No one more so the Alistair Thorne and Janos Slynt. The two men stood with the rest and surveyed the wilderling horde arrayed before them. That was when the plan was formed. Slynt and Thorne decided that their only hope was to arrange a parley with the enemy. Get someone close enough to Mance Rayder and then assassinate him. It was a suicide mission, nothing less, so who better, in Thorne's mind at least, to be sent to do the deed than John himself? It's impossible. John stated plainly to an impromptu gathering of the Watch's remaining leaders, too tired to argue the point with a more elaborate explanation. Bastards are together because of Rayder, if what you tell us is true. Thorne hissed, his hatred plain. He dies and the army fragments. John sat in silence, shaking his head. Not for the first time did he regret the death of Donal Noyce during the attack on the wall. He could have done with the man's support now. The boy's craven. Slynt scowled, his jowls quivering with disdain. What do you expect from someone with traitor's blood? It took John's sleep-deprived mind to work his way around the meaning of the man's words. Do you refer to my father, my lord? A coward and simple. Slynt answered with a wry smile, looking at the other brothers to share the jest. John's punch sent the man spinning into the wall of the mess hall. Slynt crumpled against the wall, raising his arms to ward off enough assault and pulling his legs into his chest for protection from further harm. Seeing the man acting so cowardly dispelled Jon's anger as quickly as it had come. He withdrew before Thorn's men could intercede. Seeing the assailant giving up the fight was a cause for uncertainty amongst the other brothers. They paused, hovering in between their leader and the hero of the recent battle. Slynt, for his part, seemed to rediscover his courage. "I'll have your head, boy." "Be quiet, my lord." Maester Aemon snapped from his seat at the table. The blind eyes looking aimlessly about him, yet it was clear the man had heard every word. The Maester's face was grave. "Let the man speak." Thorn glared angrily at Aemon for once again saving Jon from his right and proper punishment. But he said nothing, instead gesturing angrily towards him, urging him to say his piece. Jon paused a moment, gathering his arguments. "It's foolish, my lords. Even were I to be successful in getting close enough to attack Rhaegar, I'll be cut down before I could land a blow. Does the thought of death unman you?" Thorn sniffed, his eyes nothing more than dark slits of malice. "Is your stomach so weak that you fear even trying?" He shook his head angrily. "From what you say, the half-hand gave his life so that you could infiltrate the Wildling camp. What greater meaning to his death can you give than this?" The young man gritted his teeth in response to the cutting jibe. He knew it was pointless to argue that, even were he successful in killing Mance, there was no guarantee that the Wildling army would give up and simply leave. In fact, it was most unlikely. They are fleeing a far worse fate to the north of them. They cannot go home. The only option for them is to seek refuge to the south of the wall. Yet, for all that, better to make the attempt and try than wait here for either Slynt and Thorn to hang me or for the enemy to storm the gates. Resigned, Jon left the castle, went into the long tunnel that had been cut through the ice barrier and emerged on the northern side of the wall. He then boldly set out across the snow to where the Wildling host waited. Predictably, the Wildling scouts intercepted Jon long before he arrived at the enemy's line. They removed the knife he had brought with him and checked him thoroughly for other weapons, though they found nothing else. Jon was glad that he had left Longclaw safe in his chamber. He had not wanted to present House Mormont's family heirloom as a gift to the very people the former Lord Commander had spent his life fighting. Once again he was brought before Mance Rayder as a prisoner. His hands were bound, his bruised and battered face betraying the fact that he had fought in the skirmish at Castle Black, yet his black apparel equally making it clear that he had been on the other side than Tormund and his party. The tent he was taken to was positioned at the edge of the tree line, protected from the snow and wind by large overhanging branches. Inside he found the so-called king beyond the wall. The former brother of the Night's Watch sat on a fallen log that his people had built a tent around. Behind the slim man was his heavily pregnant wife Dalla, as well as her sister Val, who stood watch over her sibling like a mother bear around its cub. Dalla looked like she might go into labor at any moment, and Jon supposed it was her condition that was the reason Mance was hidden in a tent as opposed to out sharing the cold with the men he led. Mance, for his part, did not appear surprised to see Jon there. He chuckled without humor and smiled without warmth. He simply gave a small nod of understanding and scrutinized the envoy before him for a moment before speaking. Without even an attempt at preamble, the so-called king beyond the wall had turned to Jon and, in a quiet voice, he recounted that his host had scouted the fist of the first men on their journey south. They had found the site of Mormont's stand against the enemy and the signs of the Watch's utter defeat and flight home. "You lost many good men out there on the fist," Mance pointed out. "And many more defending the wall." Jon almost replied before he caught himself. Instead he replied, "As did you. Tormund still lives, but most of his party died in the assault." Mance sighed, waving a hand to a waiting cauldron that had a fire lit under it. Mance's good sister, Val, came forward from the dark recesses of the tent and poured the cauldron's contents into two makeshift goblets that were made with some sort of clay. The beautiful Wildling proffered the goblet to her leader and Jon. He peered into the depths of the goblet. It was a dark broth that was common amongst the free folk. Saluting each other, the pair drank a toast to the other's dead. Somberly they sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on the cost of their continuing enmity. Commiserations over, the Wildling chief quickly wasted no time in pointing out that the enemy they faced was one who had equal hatred of Wildling and Crow alike. It was not something Jon could dispute. "I mean to lead my people through the wall," Mance stated matter-of-factly. "Believe me, I will do so, even if I have to climb over dead crows to do it." John nodded, accepting that as simple truth. What leader of his people, faced with such danger as the one facing them, could do less? However, Mance went on. I would rather you just opened the gate and let us through peacefully. John blinked. Peacefully? Why not? Mance countered sharply at John's incredulity. If you let us through, then I have no reason to harm any of you. Tell that to the ones who have already died. John pointed out, his mind flashing back to the faces of the dead friends they had so recently burnt. Tormund's attack failed. Mance allowed with a narrow nod of the head. We both lost people. I won't apologize. He breathed out shortly, the air misting as it hit the cold air. However, we are where we are. Let us through or I'll bring down the wall. John almost laughed. And how by the gods will you do that? The former ranger's eyes had narrowed at his prisoner's mocking tone. I have the Horn of Winter. John's eyes widened. Could it be possible? The Grid had mentioned Mance's search for the item many times during their travels, but John had dismissed such talk as fantasy. A horn with the power to bring down the wall. It seemed ridiculous. One sound of the horn and the wall crumbles. Mance reminded him. Or at least so the old myths say. The older man spread his hands in a mock invitation. Shall we see if the legends are true? Behind John, several wildlings had brought forward a large war horn some 8 feet long. The black object was impressive. Even so, John could scarce believe it. It could, after all, merely be an ornate horn made from one of the large creatures he had seen roaming the lands north of the wall. Thinking fast, he turned to regard Mance again. If you have it, why not use it? The man shrugged. I may yet have to. He gestured behind John again. That being said, I'd rather keep that icy monstrosity intact though. It may well be the only thing that can stop the undead demons pursuing us. His eyes twinkled. Let us through and you can have it. Have it? John almost spat out the broth. You'd give it to us? Of course. Mance said, a shadow of a smile crossed his face. Once we're through the wall I will have no use for it. As I say, I'd rather leave the barrier standing if I can. Of course, once on the other side you'd want to have it protecting you. John was about to speak, but he was cut off by the sudden sound of horns. A cacophony of sound assailed him. Mance bolted from the log and raced through the tent opening into the wood beyond. Seemingly forgotten, John followed slowly, not knowing what was happening. Surely Thorn would not be as stupid enough as to launch an assault on a host this large. A massive fight was in progress. Both flanks of the Wildling army were under attack. Their lines had been sundered by a wave of mounted cavalry that had slammed into the free folk with the force of anvil. They had crushed through the first few ranks and were getting closer to Mance's position. John's mind had had trouble processing what he was seeing. Where had these men come from? The Watch had no cavalry to speak of. Even if they had the horses, then they certainly did not have the men, not to mention the full plate armor that glinted in the midday light. Some of the mounted men had standards, but, with the distance, falling snow and chaotic morass of men who were running this way and that, all John could make out that the banner was some sort of object wreathed in flame, but, beyond that he had no clue who these new arrivals were. Back! Mance cried to the men around him. Back to the trees. It was no use. Any order that the wildlings might have possessed had been sundered by the attacking force. Men were falling left and right as the armored men hacked down with their broadswords and skewered the running wildlings with lances. Further back from the horsemen John could see a mass wave of footmen. Their shields were locked, their spears pointing through the gaps. A quick glance told John that the men were advancing from both directions, rolling up the wildling flanks with brutal efficiency. It was carnage. Faced with a disciplined force and tactics, the wildlings were routed in mere moments. Their force was decimated and the free folk turned to flee rather than stay and fight. As wildlings raced past, John heard a muted cry behind him. Turning around, John saw Mance helping Dalla to the tent floor. The wildling woman was gripping her belly and crying out in evident pain. Val was on her other arm whispering calmly, but her face betrayed their anguish. Evidently, she and Mance had tried to get the pregnant woman clear, but they had run out of time. The child was coming and even an attacking army could do nothing to stop it. Cut me loose, John said clearly. Mance looked up at him. What? John raised his tight hands so that he could direct the man's attention. He repeated, cut me loose. The man looked at him as if he was mad. His attention was diverted by another cry from his partner. Why would I do that? You need someone to protect you, John said, looking about him. The wildlings were now in full flight with Mance's men all gone. The man was deserted but for his good sister. And the mounted forces were getting nearer. Mance tore his eyes from Dalla to the advancing enemy. He looked back at John. Why should I trust you? He asked, his voice full of with anxiety and stress, a tone showing he was a man pushed almost beyond endurance. His army is routed, the enemy near, and the woman he loves about to wage a fight all of her own. John looked at the man in total sincerity. I know nothing of the army out there, and I know nothing of childbirth. He looked over his shoulder. What I do know is that I'll be more use out there than I will be in here. The sound of hooves grew louder. John straightened. I give you my word. Mance looked about to refuse before Val's voice interrupted them both. Mance, what does it matter? Just do it. At the woman's words the wildling leader seemed to spring into action, jumping to his feet and cutting John's bonds. He pressed the knife into John's hands. I'm trusting the word of a son of Ned Stark, boy. Don't make me regret it. John looked down at the knife in his hands, aware of the proximity of Mance, now only protected by furs. His eyes took in the pregnant woman with her anxious sister standing over her. Saw the fear in Raider's eyes. He was gripped with an instant of uncertainty. He had given his word. What would father do? And with that he made his way to the entrance to the tent. To stand watch and defend his enemy if it came to that. I thought of them as saviors when I first saw them. John reflected of the men engaged in combat in front of where he lay, furiously attempting to cut down the wildlings who still tried in vain to get to him. To think, they now fight my friends and allies. He could have smiled at the absurdity of it all, but instead the best he could manage was a pain-filled grimace instead. Funny how life turns out. There was nothing humorous to John, of course, when he had first met the armored knights who had routed the wildlings. With every passing moment they neared the tent. John had stood watching the approach, Dalla's agonized cries echoing from within the tent behind him. John's hand gripped the knife given to him by Raider, its presence offering scant comfort. If one of the knights rode him down, there was little he could do. He waited as the remnants of the wildling force fled into the trees, the horsemen maintaining the charge for as long as the dense foliage permitted it. John watched it all with a sense of detachment. True, the wildlings were the enemy, but they were brave and resourceful. The steward respected them as foes and almost regretted the fact that, for all their strength, there was little they could do against the organized force that now hunted them down with ruthless efficiency. Like nobles on a stag or boar hunt. It was not long before the presence of the makeshift shelter drew the attention of a number of mounted men. At some signal a pair of horses headed his way, their horses' hooves kicking up snow as they raced towards the tent, the sound echoing over the rapid beating of his heart as it thudded in his chest. Taking a deep breath, John took a series of strides out of the tent and away from cover. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. As one of the men drew up to him, the other rode on by and circled behind. At any second John expected to be skewered by a lance or spear. But the man waited for instructions from the figure in front of him, who was looking down at John's face, scrutinizing his appearance. "You wear the clothes of the watch?" the warrior observed, his voice echoing within the tight confines of his helm. "I do, sir," John said politely. Grateful not to have been killed out of hand. It gave him a chance, a slim one to be sure, but one nonetheless. "I had come from Castle Black to speak to the wildling commander." He felt the second man come to a stop just behind him, so close he could feel the horse's warm breath on the nape of his neck. "The commander?" the knight asked quizzically. "Mance Raider," John replied. "He is in the tent behind me, tending to his pregnant wife. He is no threat." He looked about at the remains of the devastated wildling host. "Especially not now." "I see." The knight's head came up and John could imagine him trying to spy into the dark recesses of the tent through the narrow slit of his helm's visor. There was a pause before the knight adjusted his pose, affording John a view of his shield, onto which was painted 3 colored spirals on a white background. He did not recognize the pattern, which either meant that this was a new faction in Westeros or that the knight in front of him belonged to a house of such minor renown that Jon had never heard of them. Either that or I paid even less attention to Maester Luwin's teachings than I thought. Search the tent. Jon's questioner commanded the other man still somewhere behind him. Jon felt the warming breath disappear as the horse moved. Wait, he said before he realized he had spoken. Mance and all those within are under my protection. The knight laughed from atop his horse. Protection? What protection can you extend, boy, armed with just a knife? His hand gripped the bone handle of the blade. It gave him little solace. Even so, sir, they belong to the watch. The knight shook his head, almost in admiration, though the helm obscured any expression. I admire your balls, boy, if not your brains. The man's head came up and addressed the soldier behind Jon. Bring more men and we will take this commander and his family into custody. Doubtless his grace will wish to speak with him. Yes, Sir Justin. The other man replied, still beyond Jon's field of vision. A horse brayed as it was redirected and, with a flick of the reins, was off towards a large gathering of the mounted knights that had paused in their pursuit of the wildlings. The man who remained gave a courteous nod towards the departing rider. He will return momentarily and then we shall continue this discussion. They waited for a moment in awkward silence. The only sound beside the women in labor was the slowly diminishing sounds of combat and fleeing wildlings. It took but a moment for Jon to find the silence between he and the other man to be unbearable. You mentioned his grace, sir. Jon said, trying to mask his trepidation. I am surprised to find King Joffrey this far north. The man to whom Jon had been speaking to barked out a shrill laugh. That abomination. You think we serve him? The sudden laughter unnerved the knights' mounts, which skittered anxiously for the briefest of moments before the rider got it back under control. Once done, he returned his attention to Jon, giving another wry chuckle. No, boy, the knight said. This host serves Stannis Baratheon, first of his name the true king of the Andals and the first men, chosen of the Lord of Light, wielder of Lightbringer and protector of the realm. Well, Jon reflected as the vast attacking host gave chase to the wildlings through the trees. Maybe they got that last part right. The knight's voice echoed behind him. Evidently he had seen Jon's eyes watching the advancing army. He gave another laugh. The watch called for aid, did it not? They had been joined shortly by a large host of soldiers, both mounted and on foot. Jon was quickly relieved of his knife. He had no option but to surrender, he was outnumbered by a significant margin. When the men entered the tent to confirm what was going on within, they returned hurriedly and reported back to the mounted knight who still sat atop his steed, watching the scene. He had raised his visor so that Jon could make out the man's face. It was pleasant enough, with pink cheeks and blue eyes. It is as the man suggests, Sir Justin. A veteran soldier in worn armor and with weathered features reported. 2 wilderling women, one of whom is in labor, and a soul warrior. Has he surrendered his weapons? The man identified as Sir Justin asked. He has, sir. The soldier replied, indicating a man behind him who held Mance's sheathed longsword in his left hand. Gave us no trouble. He gave a jerk of his head. His priorities are on the woman, his lady, if I had to guess. Then take them into custody. Sir Justin ordered, fixing Jon with a stern expression in case he might object. We'll take them back to Castle Black. The soldier coughed slightly, obviously hesitant to obey. Sir Justin, it may not be wise to move them at the moment. The man looked uncomfortable. I know little about these things, but the woman appears in some distress. As if on cue, a cry of pain from Dalla reached them from the tent. It was a sound suffused with agony and more than a hint of fear. The men looked amongst themselves in obvious discomfort, none more so than Sir Justin, who avoided looking up at the tent. The woman is giving birth. In an icy wood, no less, with enemies all around her. What would you expect? Sir Justin thought for a moment, as if thinking through a decision. Finally, he gave an awkward nod. Send a rider to the castle, have a master sought for the woman. As one of the knights rode back towards the wall, the leader of the group resumed speaking, you men will remain here. Once this business is done, bring the wilderling leader and the women before King Stannis. The men looked as though they may object, but, after a moment's silence, they merely saluted, clearly having thought better of it. "Come, boy," Sir Justin commanded. "We had best be off." John blinked. "I should stay here, sir. I can return to the wall after the birth." The knight shook his head dismissively. "You will return now, boy. His Grace will want a report." The clipped tone of the man irritated John. "I do not answer to King Stannis," he pointed out firmly. "All of us answer to the rightful king." Sir Justin shot back firmly. "They are under my protection," John replied, finding his strength beneath the tiredness. "Then protect them now by coming with me." At John's reluctance, the knight sniffed impatiently. "No harm will come to them, I swear it. What will happen to them is for His Grace to decide." Surrendering to the inevitable, John turned his back on the tent and the woods and began to trek towards the wall. John stood for a moment watching a column of men troop through the corridor that led to the tunnel that went through the wall. The ordered ranks emerged into the daytime air and marched determinedly through the courtyard and out onto the King's Road that led south. The footmen continued to come, almost an endless parade of men. "Gods, how many are there?" At John's expression, the arrogant nobleman beside him smiled. He seemed to detect the unspoken question. "We have around 18,000 fighting men." As John's face betrayed further shock, the knight guffawed smugly in response. "The entire strength of the Stormlands is here. More than enough to deal with some ragtag wilderling army unfamiliar with discipline and tactics." Thinking back to his lessons with Maester Luwin, it occurred to John that the Stormlands should have been able to field substantially more than 18,000 fighters, though he supposed that Stannis Baratheon had left the remaining men to secure his holdings in the south. That being said, 18,000 was a colossal force. "Come, boy," the knight commanded, ushering John away from the march. As they circled the courtyard, he kept his eyes on the rows of armed men that continued to pour out of the tunnel. The thudding of the men in armor across the hard, muddy ground in rhythmic unison had an almost hypnotic effect. "Gods, it's like a stream that won't end." Evidently Stannis Baratheon had sailed up the eastern coast of Westeros and landed on the north side of the wall before riding west to support the Watch. It made sense, John reasoned. If the aim of the king was to support Castle Black, it would be best to deploy his massive host in good order before riding into battle. While such strength would have supported the wall in its defensive measures, it would not have allowed the king to form up his men in an offensive manner to destroy the enemy. The wall that they were using for defense would have been a barrier to the king's army in striking out and taking the fight to the wildlings. No wonder the wildlings were so roundly beaten. John mused with a heavy heart. The wildlings thought they faced a diminished Watch that had taken shelter behind the defense of the wall. He shook his head. "I warned Ygritte that a proper Westerosi army would make short work of the free folk in a straight-up battle. In here." With a start, John realized they were at the entrance to the King's Tower at one corner of the courtyard. Ordinarily it was reserved for honored guests, though, until recently Lord Commander Mormont had taken it as his own after the fire caused during the attack on the Lord Commander's life. With a heavy heart, John realized that the tower of course would be empty at the moment, and likely to remain that way until a new Lord Commander was elected or that the fire damage to the chambers previously occupied by Jeor Mormont were repaired. Though, of course, that was not to be the case. As they neared the heavy oak door that marked the entrance to the round tower, John saw that a heavy guard has been posted around the tower, evidently to guard some eminent person within. Multiple sentries wearing the garb of the House Baratheon stood watch, still wearing their battle armor and castle-forged weaponry. "Stannis." The guards eyed John and the knight approached warily but stood aside and allowed them to enter without a word being spoken. They climbed the circular staircase, their route familiar to John from his time as Mormont's steward. It has been a brief period, but John was aware of the route to the main chamber. This too was guarded by a number of armed men. At the knight's command they were permitted entry to the tower's upper level. With a loud groan the heavy wooden door swung open and admitted John into what had been, until recently, Jeor Mormont's solar. The scene that greeted them was akin to a battle commander's tent in the middle of a campaign. Knights and warriors still in their armor, with their helms underarm, stood around the Lord Commander's former desk making reports and declaring the readiness of their men. So tightly clumped were the men that John could not see the figure to whom they were actually making their respective reports. Abruptly, at a presumed signal from their master, the armored men fell silent and stepped away from the desk. As the knight beside him nodded, John stepped forwards to see the man the knights had made space for. He had expected another Robert Baratheon somehow, a large fat man long past his prime and in his cups more often than not. Instead what greeted him was quite the opposite. A thin tall man sat before him with broad shoulders and seemingly possessed of a wry energy that almost emanated from his form. There was nothing of the lethargy that has been part of the man's older brother. That was not the only difference. King Robert had a full head of hair and a bushy beard grown out and wild to try to cover up his multiple chins. Stannis, in contrast, was balding with a tightly shaved beard that framed the bottom of his long face. While the fat king has adorned himself in silk garb and costly, colorful armament, this man still sat in his form-fitting, somewhat plain armor that's only color was the heart shape etched into his chest, red as blood and framed by the tendrils of flame. Servant of the Lord of Light indeed. On the table was a sheathed sword. Though it had a plain pommel and scabbard, the weapon looked expensive, especially if the hilt was any indication, something a king and warrior might wear. Was this Lightbringer, the sword spoken of by the soldiers in the woods? It looked nothing special to the young night watchman. But the thing that had drawn his eyes the most on that occasion had been the eyes of the man in the center of the room. They were fiercely blue, alert and intelligent, that took his measure in the space of a moment and appeared to tell the king all he wanted to know about the man before him. The commander of the Baratheon forces moved his eyes to the knight at Jon's side. "And who is this Sir Justin?" The voice was smooth, calm and full of intelligence, yet without warmth or humor. "This is the man found with Mance Rayder, your grace," the knight declared, staring straight ahead as if on a parade ground. "He's a member of the Watch." "So it would appear." The man who could only be King Stannis replied with a bored look. "Why bring him here? A turncloak from the Watch is of no interest to me." It made sense, Jon supposed. A logical conclusion to the situation. There he had been clad in the black garb of a watchman, yet defending the pregnant wife of the Wilderling chief as he had anxiously tended to her. Even so the injustice rankled, a surge of anger gripped Jon, the events of the last few weeks caught up with him in a flash. "I am no defector," Jon bit out before he could stop himself. "I was in the Wilderling camp because my brothers sent me there to negotiate a truce." He toyed briefly with the notion of mentioning his assignment to kill the Wilderling commander, but thought better of it. It would not help his situation to mention his mission to assassinate one self-styled king when he stood before another. If the king cared for his words, he could not have shown less interest. "What you are is of no consequence." He waved a hand dismissively in his direction. "Have him taken to the cells, where he will wait until we decide what to do with him." "Yes, your grace," Sir Justin replied instantly. Before Jon could speak, strong hands seized his arms and began to haul him away. He looked at the owner of the hands only to be greeted by a nightmarish vision. By the gods! A burnt face with blood seeping from sores from hideous wounds looked at him. The only sign of life being the figure's eyes, yet even these were glazed over like a drunkard. Mindlessly and with singular determination, not to mention a strength that belied its size, the sentry pulled him towards the entrance to the solar. Powerless to resist, Jon allowed himself to be strong-armed to the entryway before something he heard made him push back against the creature. "You may proceed with mass graves, Sir Axel," the king had commanded from behind him. "Have the bodies taken care of?" "No," Jon cried, somehow finding the energy to turn around, yanking himself from the monstrosity's grip as it made to seize him once more. "Burn the dead, your grace." He was being pulled away yet again when the king raised a hand which stayed the efforts. For what purpose? Jon used the opportunity so that they may not rise to fight again. He expected the assembled men to laugh at him. He was shocked to discover that the gathering of lords and knights seemed to nod in understanding, as if they should have expected such an occurrence and were cursing the stupidity that it had not first occurred to them. For his part, Stannis merely stared before he too nodded in agreement. Of course he flicked a hand towards a man stood by his side. "As the boy says, strip the bodies of armor and clothing and reduce them to cinders." "Strip them, your grace?" the knight, a heavyset man with overly large ears, asked dully. "Indeed," Stannis said, turning his focus once more to the reports. "We will have need of the extra clothing and armor before too long." He glanced upwards. "The dead will have no more use of it." His eyes flicked to regard Jon. "Your name, young man?" "Jon, your grace," he answered with a hint of tiredness. He was bone-weary and the sudden burst of energy had drained him of what strength he'd had left. Jon Snow. Snow. Stannis Baratheon mulled it over for a moment before giving another nod, almost in dismissal. Belay my original order. Take the man to the Shield Hall and return him to the custody of his brothers. Let them decide what to do with him. This way, lad, Sir Justin said, stepping in and prompting the burned man to relinquish his grip on Jon's arm. I'll escort you. Jon was about to say something more, but a quick shake of Sir Justin's head deterred him. The fair-headed knight indicated they should leave. Once outside, Jon let out a heavy breath he was not aware he had been holding. He rounded on the knight who was right behind him. What the hell was he? A fire white. Justin said in a muted tone as he indicated the stairs back down to the courtyard. Another servant of the Lord of Light. He looked nervously behind him. As are we all. We must be prepared to sacrifice if the Lord has need of us. Jon tried to make sense of it all as they started their descent to the courtyard. His thoughts were interrupted by Sir Justin, though now the man's words were little more than a whisper. Though some are called upon to sacrifice far more than others. Jon had been returned to the company of the Watch's leadership who, along with the rest of the surviving garrison, had been gathered in the Shield Hall by the Baratheon army with guards posted by the Shield Hall entrances. His arrival was greeted by Thorne and Slynt with nothing more than irritation and an even greater measure of contempt than they had when they had last seen him. Evidently the fact he was still breathing was an unwelcome development. He was fast becoming to think the same of them. Yet their disappointment at his survival was somewhat muted, overtaken as it was by recent developments. Jon sat in a corner of the Shield Hall with a number of other survivors of the recent defense of the castle. Among his companions was Samwell Tarly, who had made his way home after the mutiny at Craster's Keep. When violence had broken out, he had grabbed the wilderling girl Gilly and ran for his life. However, unlike Gren and the other loyalists, Sam had taken a different route south and had emerged from the forest north of the wall by the night fort. He and Gilly had joined a party of rangers, led by Sir Denys Mallister and Bowen Marsh, who were on their way to Castle Black to answer Maester Aemon's call for aid. They had arrived after the battle with Manst's host, but just in time for King Stannis' army to arrive and occupy the wall. Sam had looked fearfully at his friend. I saw them, Jon. I saw them. Saw who? Jon asked as he looked at his overweight friend. Though from his friend's haunted expression, he knew what the answer would be. The others, Jon. Sam's eyes filled with tears. The others. They're Rhaegal and they're coming. They had spent the following evening talking and sharing stories of their adventures and deeds since they had parted north of the wall. The Whites, the others, even the existence of an entity named by Sam as Cold Hands, who purportedly fought on behalf of humanity in the wintry north. Sam credited Cold Hands with his and Gilly's survival, saying that, without his aid, they would certainly have never made it back to the wall. Jon told Sam about events that had befallen him since he had left on his mission with the Half-Hand all the way until being captured by Stannis' men. When he had finished, the two brothers sat in silence for some time. Both tales separately confirmed what the other man believed to be true about the oncoming enemy. It gave neither of them comfort that they were both right about the reality of what they faced. As the night wore on, they were informed by one of Stannis' retainers that the Watch would be given sole control of Castle Black again come the morning. The Baratheon host was being deployed along the wall's remaining castles. Jon was pondering his next move an hour later when Sir Justin returned to the hall. The king wishes to see you, the knight declared, somewhat pompously. He's in the tower, talking to your blind maester. Maester Aemon? Jon asked, sharing a look with Sam. It had occurred to them some time before that the elderly maester was not present with the rest of the Watch who had been gathered in the hall. Their enquiries to the sentries who guarded them received no worthwhile response. You have another maester who cannot see. Massey replied, gesturing impatiently for Jon to follow him. They have been in discussion for at least an hour or more. The man offered Jon a small smile as he lifted himself wearily to his feet. Blind he may be, but stupid he is not. The king has no time for fools. Jon might have said something more, but he was eager to actually do something after hours of inactivity. He followed the Baratheon retainer from the hall. He felt the eyes of both Thorne and Slynt follow him from the room as he was escorted by Massey back out into the training ground. John once more ascended the 100 feet or more that led to the tower's solar. He entered to see the king in a conversation with Maester Eamon, who was sat in a chair opposite Stannis' own and with someone with whom he had seen before but not been introduced to. This muscularly stout man, clothed in heavy furs, stood by the desk that divided the seated men. His ugly face was flushed from being interrupted by Jon's arrival. To the rear of the chamber stood a thin man with his hands clasped behind his back. He was listening to the discussion with an intent look upon his friendly face. Off to the other side of the room stood a woman dressed all in red with flame-colored hair and pale skin. She was positioned next to a flaming brazier with her back to the rest of the room. Even positioned as she was, he could make out the curves of her figure. Her every movement whispered a promise of seduction and sensuality. He doubted very much somehow that this woman was Stannis' queen. Her ephemeral beauty would have looked out of place next to the dour, severe-looking king. "Snow, your grace," Sir Justin announced as they entered, stepping to one side and allowing Jon to proceed on his own to the center of the room. "Your grace," Jon said, bowing his head in respect as he looked at Eamon, who was staring aimlessly ahead of him. Not for the first time did he wish that the man had the use of his eyes. Much could be said by a look in such circumstances. He should not be here. The ugly man snarled, looking Jon up and down with hostility. "Even if you accept Maester Eamon vouching for his loyalty and competence, he is still merely a steward. Hardly a position of responsibility. Jon Snow was handpicked by the former Lord Commander Mormont to be his steward, your grace," Maester Eamon observed, his calm voice in stark contrast to the standing man's own. "Furthermore, he has earned the respect of the Watch owing to his actions during the attack by the wildlings. It is in no small part due to him that the wall was still standing when your grace so opportunely arrived." Eamon cocked his head. "You would be wise to listen to what he can tell you." "As you say, Maester." Stannis, with a touch of respect in his voice for the elderly man in front of him. "I will hear what he has to say." "Your grace," the knight protested. "Surely Lord Slynt or Sir Alisa would be more." "Enough," Stannis stated, rising from his chair. He turned his head to regard the man behind Jon. "Sir Justin, you are to escort the Maester to the Shield Hall. He has agreed that the election of a new Lord Commander will be held as soon as possible." Jon's mind raced. "An election?" He answered his own question just as quickly. Of course, with Jeor Mormont dead, the position of leader of the Night's Watch was vacant. Clearly Stannis Baratheon did not intend for that to be the situation for very long. "But surely your grace," the unruly knight opined, clearly not finished. "If we waited until after the election to consult with whomever, we do not have the luxury of time," Stannis declared with a firm wave of his hand. "You forget, Sir Axel, that the enemy is likely already moving. I will have them ready when we do. For that I need information. In the meantime," the king looked decidedly at his lieutenant, "you have your orders." The knight named Sir Axel seemed to chew on this for a moment before mumbling a curt acknowledgement, giving an elaborate bow and leaving the room abruptly. Sir Justin moved to the side of Maester Eamon's chair. "If you take my hand, Maester, I will see you safely down the steps and to the Shield Hall." Soon the only people remaining in the room were the gruff older knight dressed in plain clothes and the exotic red woman who continued to stare into the fire set off to one side. Her eyes flickered in seeming understanding as the flames licked into the air. "Maester Eamon thinks very highly of you," Stannis said, breaking the silence. Jon resisted the urge to smile. "I think very highly of him, your grace." "As well you should," Stannis answered, resuming his seat. "A man who has lived as long, and experienced as much, as Aemon Targaryen should be respected." Jon blinked. "So, he knows the real identity of Maester Eamon." He stared for a moment, unsure what to say. Robert Baratheon had had a burning hatred of the Targaryen dynasty, and he felt a flash of fear that the younger brother may well feel the same. Stannis caught his look and offered a knowing stare. "Your Maester is no threat to me, Snow. Even were he not now a sworn brother of the Night's Watch and pledged to surrender all rights and privileges, the man also wears the chain of a Maester of the Citadel. I have nothing but respect for the Order and would not willingly harm a member of that august group. Maester Eamon will not be harmed by any who serve me." Jon gave a cautious nod. At a gesture from the king he took the chair so recently occupied by the man they were discussing. "You wanted to see me, your grace?" John said, looking at the other man, trying to assess the person before him. Stannis Baratheon was inscrutable, though he gave a slight dip of the head that might have been a nod. I did. I have spent the last few hours hearing about your exploits north of the wall. The king settled his hands in his lap. Not to mention the desultory situation that not only the Night's Watch but the North itself finds itself in. Jon was tempted to refute the man's words but quickly realized that was pointless. The Watch, much reduced in numbers over the recent years, was now a shadow of its former self with barely a few hundred souls. Its leadership and best fighters had been killed north of the wall, and many who had remained had fallen during the attack by Tormund's raiding party. As for the North, Jon did not know what the true situation was. The grizzled warrior moved forward to behind Stannis' right. His countenance was one of politeness and warmth, the direct opposite to the man who had just left. He gave a look of comfort to Jon. We have heard many rumors since even before we sailed from the Stormlands. The man recounted. Stories that the North has risen in rebellion against the Starks, with houses Bolton and Dustin leading the revolt. The man paused for a moment, to say nothing of Ironborn raiders at Deepwood Motte, Moat Cailin and Winterfell itself. Jon swallowed slowly, merely nodding. The king and his man seemed better informed than he was, and besides he had heard nothing that contradicted what he had been told himself from other sources. The thin man nodded, taking Jon's silence as confirmation. The North is in the midst of a civil war. Those loyal to House Stark are outnumbered and outmatched if Maester Aemon's reports have the right of it. Why is he telling me this? Jon wondered. I am just the former Lord Commander's steward after all. At his confused look the standing man smiled. But all is not lost, Jon Snow. We've heard that your brother has beaten the Lannisters in a pitched battle and marches on King's Landing as we speak, while your father rides north with an army to liberate your homeland. They know who I am. Jon's eyes flicked from the man to King Stannis. My father? He asked, feigning ignorance. Sir Davos Seaworth refers to Lord Eddard Stark. Stannis stated bluntly, though he then raised an eyebrow. Maester Aemon informs us that you are his bastard. Ordinarily the mention of his status would have irritated him, but Jon found no insult in King Stannis' words, so he said nothing. In any case he was distracted. Father is alive. Alive, free and riding home. His mind whirled. I see the Maester spoke true. The king noted as he sat forward and steepled his fingers on the desk, coming to rest his chin on his fingertips. It is interesting that you find yourself here. Some would call it fate. Sir Davos noted quietly, casting a look at the woman in red by the fire. As if detecting his glance, the woman turned from her vigil. There is no such thing as fate, Sir Davos. All will be as the Lord of Light wills it. The thin man grimaced as he turned his eyes back to the king and his guest. As it is the Ironborn have garrisoned Moat Cailin. Though I have to believe that Lord Eddard will find a way past them. He will succeed. Stannis stated, as though it was already an accomplished fact. Both I and the Maester agree. Stark knows the North in a way the Ironborn never could. Once he is through the moat, the rebellion will be crushed. The man's lower lip curled with disdain. Neither Bolton nor Greyjoy will stand against a northern army with Stark at its head. I agree, your grace. Jon offered in a hushed whisper. Inwardly he felt a sense of hope that he had not felt in a long time. Father will reclaim the North and send our family's enemies running. After that he is bound to assist us with the others. How gratifying. Stannis said with an arched eyebrow, eyeing him with interest. Jon's heart ran cold. The king means to use me as a hostage. To force father to follow their bidding. Again, the king seemed to read his mind. In the meantime, however, we have preparations to make. Preparations, your grace. Indeed. Stannis said firmly, he titled his head. In the first instance. I am sure you are curious as to why we are here. The question had occurred to me, your grace. Jon admitted honestly. We had hoped that some of Westeros would answer our plea for aid, but, I confess, we never dreamed that such a force as the one you have would arrive. We received no such summons. Sir Davos claimed regretfully. Maester Aemon believes that the Boltons and their allies are preventing all ravens from escaping the north. Jon made no attempt to hide his confusion. How then, your grace, did you come to be here? The Lady Melisandre saw the need of the watch in her flames. The king turned his head to acknowledge the woman by the fire. She is a priestess of Arla and has the gift of foresight as well as ancient knowledge. It is because of her visions that we find ourselves here. The woman in red seemed not to have heard the men talking. Instead she continued to gaze intently into the burning coals before her. Sir Davos shifted uncomfortably where he stood as he glanced uneasily at the priestess. The lady has power unknown to mortal men. The words were almost an admission. Her visions informed us of the Wilderling invasion and the threat that spurred it on. Threat. Let us not bandy words, Snow. Stannis snapped, his face a mask. We know of the others amassing in the snows to the north. We know it is the threat of this ancient foe that has caused the Wilderling to combine their strength and look for passage through the wall. Jon's mouth almost fell open in surprise. Here he was expecting to have to convince the Southern King that the threat posed by the wildlings was minor in the grand scheme of things when faced with the threat posed by the others. Now he found that the Baratheon king was already well aware of the situation. At his look of confusion Stannis smiled thinly. You have not only Lady Melisandre's visions to thank Snow, but also Sir Davos' wise words of counsel. The king nodded slightly to the retainer standing at his side. He reminded me of my duty. That, as king, I should look to protect the realm. Rather than fight with the Lannisters in the south I should address the real threat in the north. That explains it. Jon mused. It did not seem likely that Stannis Baratheon would have sailed the length of Westeros with what it seemed was almost his entire army simply because an aged Maester of the Night's Watch asked it of him. We are most grateful for your aid, Your Grace. Jon said politely, dipping his head respectfully to the other two individuals present in the room. Whomever we have to thank. A brief flash of irritation crossed Stannis' face. Indeed. My vanguard reports that the Wilderling host that planned to invade the wall has been utterly broken and fled back through the forest leading north. Jon nodded. I would suspect no less, Your Grace. Absent Mance Raider's leadership they will fragment and divide back into their various tribes and factions. Stannis looked at Jon with an expression of grim satisfaction. Then it is fortunate that we have Raider in one of the watch cells. The irony of the former ranger sitting in the watch-size cells beneath Castle Black might once have seemed like justice to Jon. Instead he looked directly at the king. What of Mance's wife? What of Dalla and her child? If they are with Mance, if he has imprisoned a woman and newborn child in such a place. Stannis Baratheon did not pause. Dead. Mother and child both. Anger surged within Jon. He felt his face redden with rage. Peace, Jon Snow. Sir Davos implored him, clearly seeing the young man's building reaction. They died in childbirth before we could get a Maester out to assist them. The man looked pained. It was tragic, but, I promise you, none of our doing. Jon's anger did not dissipate as easily as Sir Davos had clearly hoped it would. While he believed the retainer's words, the man seemed earnest in his compassion. Jon had not liked the easy way Stannis had dismissed Dalla and her child. The death of children should never be taken so lightly. To gainsay Jon's possible response to this news, Sir Davos ploughed ahead. We are holding Wilderling captives taken during the rout on the other side of Castle Black in a makeshift stockade. It was felt wiser to keep Raider apart from them until the king decides what to do with him. I am tempted to hand him over to the watch. Stannis observed, sitting back in his chair and idly setting his clasped hands before him. He was one of their number, I believe. He was, Your Grace. Jon allowed. Though it was some time ago. An oath-breaker is an oath-breaker, regardless of how long ago his actions were taken. The king declared, his face setting stubbornly. I hardly need remind you that a member of the watch serves for life. He does. Jon agreed, feeling it was pointless to do otherwise. He was well aware of the oath that he himself had taken when he became a brother of the Night's Watch. The king eyed him for a long moment as if he was looking into Jon's soul. And what, in your opinion, will the watch do with him? He will be executed, Your Grace. Jon said, certainty suffusing his voice. He could not see how it could be otherwise. Regardless of whomever is elected as Lord Commander. Your Maester agrees. Stannis noted. A fate that is well deserved. There was silence for a moment, then the king abruptly stood and walked to a window overlooking the yard way below. He crossed his arms as if lost in thought. The fate of Raider, however, raises an interesting point. I understand that the Watch will soon gather to elect its new Lord Commander. Jon could think of nothing to say beyond giving a nod of confirmation. In all the recent activity and fighting, Mormont's death at Craster's Keep, and the need to replace him, was not something he'd had time to consider. Stannis glanced at him briefly before continuing. I have a vested interest in this election and its outcome. Your Grace forgive me, Jon said with an edge to his voice. That is an internal matter for the Night's Watch. It is not for outsiders to interfere. Even kings have left the Brotherhood alone since its inception. The king's face moved in what might have been a smile, though it would have been hard to tell. Do not be naive. The Iron Throne may have previously shown a lack of interest in the leadership and direction of the Night's Watch over the centuries. The leader of the army below turned away from the window and took in the room. Davos standing to one side, the Red Woman still in her position by the brazier, her fingers dancing through the flames that licked towards her flesh. Then there was Jon, who sat looking blankly at him. The king's face hardened as he took in the youth. Make no mistake, Snow. Those days are long gone. They had spent a long time after that discussing the state of the Night's Watch and the North itself. Jon was subjected to hours of questions about the likely candidates for the election to Lord Commander. After seemingly satisfying himself, Stannis moved over the state of play in the wider North itself. Here Jon felt he was not able to contribute more than what had already been provided by Maester Aemon. Seeing that Jon knew nothing more than the blind Maester, the king changed tack and demanded information about the land beyond the wall, of the wildlings themselves, and the others. It was many hours after dusk before Jon was given leave to return to his bed. Sleep eluded him that night as he replayed the conversation again and again inside his head. There was so much he did not know. So much that was uncertain. The next day saw a marked change in the regular life of Castle Black. The presence of hundreds of Baratheon soldiers would have been enough to ensure that on its own, but the death of Mormont along with so many of the Watch in the frozen north beyond the wall, not to mention the recent attack and still present threat of the wildlings, was more than enough to cause a disruption to life at the wall. First thing on the Watch's mind beyond that of outside threats was to decide on its new leader. Two candidates quickly emerged from the ranks of the Watch. The first, Cotter Pike, the commander of Eastwatch by the Sea, was a lean, hard man who was an able leader and veteran of the Watch. The other leading man was the commander of the Shadow Tower, Sir Denys Mallister. The man was old and considered to be a cautious if chivalrous man. Jon would have been happy if either became Lord Commander. It seemed however that it would be a close-run thing as both seemed to command equal support within the surviving members of the Watch. Events took an unexpected turn however, when Janos Slynt joined the race to be chosen. The frog-faced man used his position as former Lord Commander of King Landing's City Watch to appeal to the men as a solider used to command. Jon has a fair idea where such a command would lead, for him at least. He had made a fast enemy of Slynt and the other man did not strike him as someone who would forget such things. The intense rivalry between Pike and Mallister caused a deadlock that meant votes seemed to be leaning towards Slynt, who was buoyed by the support of first Sir Alliser Thorne and then Bowen Marsh, who could see no end to the struggle between the other two candidates that could result in the two-thirds majority necessary for someone to be elected as Lord Commander. Making matters worse was the presence of King Stannis, who urged, with increasing ardor with each passing day, that the election be held and a candidate chosen. It made the situation more tense than it needed to be. Be that as it may, the day of the election came fast. The members of the Night's Watch who were present at Castle Black packed themselves into the great hall for the choosing. To Jon's utter shock, the vote went in a way he was at a loss to explain. He was staggered to discover that he himself had been nominated by one of his brothers. This would have been staggering in and of itself, but then the final vote was counted and Jon was declared the winner. He had been chosen by his sworn brothers as the 998th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. He had remembered being struck dumb as the result was announced. The only thing that occurred to him then was that somehow he must have picked up votes from supporters of Cotter Pike and Denys Mallister. There was no other explanation. I should have refused. Jon tried once more to coax life back into his body, but there was none to be had. What little strength he had remaining to him kept his heart beating in his chest. Even this, he knew, was likely to be merely a temporary situation. If I had turned down the position I would not now be here. He looked about him one last time to survey the fighting. More and more people he knew, if by sight then of name, were dead or dying about him. Was it worth it? He wondered vaguely as another wave of pain and cold hit him. Once more he climbed the stairs to the king's solar. His feet heavy with the responsibility he had recently been given. The events of the day had not been as the king had predicted. But the responsibility was his now and he could not shirk it. Even that thought gave little comfort to him as he was admitted before Stannis Baratheon once again, barely Lord Commander for more than a day. It is done then. It was the first thing the king had said to him as he entered. Sir Davos Seaworth stood off to one side, watching expectantly. Jon did not know what to say in response to the king's curt words. My nomination was unexpected, Your Grace. As was my choosing. Indeed. Stannis bit out, his eyes hard like flint. It appears that the fear of either Pike or Mallister being elected was enough to cause their supporters to look for a compromise candidate. Jon grimaced slightly, one that did not come in the form of Janos Slynt. That is understandable. Seaworth offered with a slight smile. He looked at the king. You yourself said the man was unworthy of the position, Your Grace. Stannis merely glanced at his retainer without saying a word. Despite Seaworth's implied support, his grace was clearly skeptical of Jon's claims. I can't blame him. I did not plan it, Your Grace. Jon said firmly. However, once the choosing had been made, I had no option but to accept the outcome. Jon stood as straight as he could. It was my duty. The word duty seemed to invoke a reaction within Stannis Baratheon. The man's eyes hardened like steel for an instant before softening. He nodded as if to some unspoken thought. As it is, it may all be for the best. Jon steeled himself for what he knew was coming. The king had made clear his plans when they first met, and he knew that this was to be one of the first tests of the position in which he had now found himself. The king left his seat and walked to the map table set to one side of the room. The tattered and frayed parchment had a detailed topography of the full length of the wall as well as covering the lands to the immediate north and south. Jon had seen it many times during his time as the previous Lord Commander's steward. Previously there has been a number of small models adorning the table, each one representing the number of soldiers available to the watch. The young night watchman had always been struck with how few there were. A visible sign and reminder of how diminished the watch has become. The shield that guarded the world of men was but a shadow of its former self. Jon took a moment to cast an eye out towards the wall. A situation made yet more perilous by the ill-fated ranging to the north and the recent attack by the wildlings. Stannis fingered a small piece of parchment that lay on the desk in front of him. Our furthest southern scouts report frenetic activity around Last Hearth. Apparently, troops have been assembling and heading south at speed. Jon frowned. House Umber was renowned for its loyalty to the Starks, but that was scant solace given recent events. Were the scouts able to determine the troops' destination? The king looked as if he might smile at the temerity of being questioned by the young man. Not with certainty. It is clear, however, that they were not taking the King's Road. They went west a league and then crossed the last river before heading south. The action puzzled Jon, but he could give no further thought to it as the king suddenly rapped his knuckles on the map table before he turned to fully face Jon. I intend to do as we discussed before your election. Stannis said. I mean to garrison each castle along the wall with enough troops to defend them. As the Lord Commander of the Watch, I require your consent to do this. Jon blinked. He had thought of almost nothing else. By rights the wall, and all its castles, was under the jurisdiction of the Night's Watch. There were 19 such castles of different size and layout. However, in recent years many of them had been abandoned, the Watch lacking the men and resources to maintain them. Currently only 3 of the castles were occupied by the Watch. Stannis had openly declared that he wanted to billet the bulk of his army in the empty castles along the wall and used them as a base both to defend the wall from threats to the north and from any factions below in the south. He paused as he considered his response. The problem presented to him was twofold. On the one hand, the wall could not be defended by the Watch, not against another wildling attack, much less an assault by the others. There was no doubt that Stannis' army were welcome reinforcement, and given the rebellion in the north likely to be the only assistance they could help to receive for some time. On the other hand, if John granted the empty castles to Stannis Baratheon, then he would be surrendering authority to him. This would not be endearing him to the factions of the Night's Watch. What is more important, authority or safety? You may have the empty castles, your grace, John said calmly. The king's eyes narrowed. What of the ones that are occupied? John shrugged. You are also welcome to garrison soldiers at Eastwatch, the Shadow Tower and even Castle Black. However, they will remain under the jurisdiction of the Watch. Mallister and Pike will be returning to their respective posts at first light, and they will resume command there. As you will hear. I take it. I will, your grace. John agreed. As Lord Commander. Bowen Marsh will command in my absence. The words tasted funny in his mouth, as if he was referring to someone else. Stannis gave a curt nod, clearly not happy with the answer but apparently content not to pursue it for now. He crossed his arms across his chest. I have spoken to some of the Wilderling prisoners this morning. I intend to offer them settlement south if they swear fealty to me. The new Lord Commander had frowned. When you say south, your grace? Sir Davos coughed. You must understand, Snow, there are many fighting men still among their number. We could use their strength. That being said, we have captured many women and children who were part of Raiders' retinue. They cannot stay here. I agree, Sir Davos. Sooner they were far from here the better. It's better that the brothers of the Night's Watch and the Free Folk were kept as far apart as possible. They will not be far, Snow. Stannis muttered with an air of impatience. I mean to settle them on the gift. John felt like he had been doused in cold water. You cannot do that, your grace. Any sense of warmth in the room seemed to evaporate in an instant. The king's face was back to that stony mask that he seemed to have perfected. The land is needed, Snow. I require it to award the Wildings for their loyalty. It is not yours to give, your grace. John answered honestly. It was granted to the Watch in perpetuity. I do not dispute that. It is precisely for that reason that I need you to grant the use of it. The king said offhandedly. He says it like it's nothing. I cannot, your grace. He said, shaking his head. Stannis looked at him shrewdly. Cannot or will not? Somewhere a fire of stubbornness twisted in the back of John's mind. Does it make a difference? Despite the situation, he could see his retort had amused Sir Davos, who brought a gloved hand to his mouth in a curled fist, hiding his smile while appearing to contemplate the conversation. I could simply take what we need. The king said as if it was no small matter. You could. John allowed. Careful now. But the gift belongs to the Watch. It is ours by law. My father always told me you were a man of law and justice. It was a stretch, John knew, but he saw that he had struck home with Stannis. The king glared at him angrily but did not refute what he had said. Give me some time, your grace, John said by way of conciliation. I will consider the situation some more before a final decision is made. We appreciate that, as far as your brothers are concerned, it will not be a popular course of action. Davos Seaworth offered from the corner, clearly uncomfortable. As if I did not know that. Perhaps not. John agreed. However, the Watch is crucially undermanned. Right now, it is doubtful that we could resist another attack. It may be better to have the Wildlings as our friends than our foes. I will try and persuade the Watch that this might go a long way to accomplish that. Though whether good sense can override such ingrained hatred will be the issue. Very well. Stannis said with an air of impatience. It would appear that, once again, I must wait on the Watch's pleasure. He tilted his head. While we are discussing the Wildlings, I should inform you that we will execute Rhaegar tomorrow. John was expecting this. He had considered asking Stannis to spare the Wilderling leader but realized that that request would be denied and, even if it was not, would stir up nothing but hostility within the Watch. I was under the impression that your intention was to hand Mance over to the Watch for judgment, your grace. I had intended so. Stannis declared, his arms still folded. However, I presented the opportunity to him to bend the knee to me. The king frowned. Rhaegar refused me. He said he would rather die than kneel. Small surprise there. John paused to consider. I suppose it matters not who executes him as long as he is seen to be executed for his crimes. A concern sudden struck him. How will Mance be executed? I believe beheading is still the tradition, is it not? Stannis said, casting an inquiring look at Davos Seaworth. Though there are many among my followers who would prefer him to be given to the flames. Jon was well aware that the Baratheon king was inclined to use that form of execution. A sacrifice to the Lord of Light. The rumor mill of Castle Black had not been impacted by the recent conflict. With soldiers from the Stormlands and Brothers of the Watch in such proximity, idle conversation and tales were bound to be exchanged. Many had been burned in the early months of King Stannis' campaign, though there had been no reports of burnings since the attack on King's Landing. If he must be executed, he should be beheaded, Your Grace. Jon said firmly. One clean stroke. As my father would have done it. And I should be the one to wield the sword. For a long moment the king stared at him. It seemed he was about to refuse before his expression changed to one of respect. He gave a small nod in agreement. As you say, Snow. You are now Lord Commander. Rhaegar was a deserter. The right is yours. Thank you, Your Grace. It seemed obscene to thank a man for allowing him to kill another, but at least Jon could ensure it was done properly. Quick and clean. Stannis Baratheon gave a nod of finality. He returned to his paperwork, looking down as he took a roll of parchment in both hands. One last thing. Now that you have been chosen, this tower and these chambers belong to you. They will be yours by nightfall. Surprised, Jon gave what he felt was an obligatory nod of the head. It had not been a point on which he was going to push. Thank you again, Your Grace. There was a slight twitch of the other man's mouth, but he did not look up from his reading. Your thanks are unnecessary. As Lord Commander you are entitled to it. Was there bitterness in the man's voice? Jon could not have said. Donal Noyce had been right when he had told Jon many moons ago that Stannis Baratheon was a cold, unyielding man. The king's return of the chambers might have been done in the name of spite, or plain courtesy, it was impossible to tell. Jon had thought it best to say nothing as he headed to the door. As he reached for the latch, the king's voice reached him once again. You should be aware that I have already sent word to Eastwatch that the fleet is to be placed under your command. There was a slight sniff. They will take you where you wish to go. Jon stepped away from the door, turning in confusion. He was bewildered at the form that the new conversation had taken. The ships, Your Grace. This time Stannis looked up. I assume your ambition to utilize the royal fleet still stands. Jon did not know what to say. In his conversation on the garrisoning of the wall, he had completely forgotten one of the recommendations he had made when first he had been summoned to the Lord Commander's solar. He scrutinized the king's face, but there was no hint of mockery there. It does, Your Grace. Jon declared. I have spoken to Tormund Giantsbane in the cells, and he tells me that it is likely that the wildlings who survived the battle will have fled to Hardham on the eastern coast. It is an ideal place for them to take shelter, regroup and determine their next move. It had been a small part of their first conversation, and he had not really been expecting the king to be paying him attention. He had not intended to revisit their previous discussion for a day or two. Unexpectedly Stannis had struck before him. I propose to sail there and offer refuge to any who may seek it. He paused before finishing. My intention would be to only borrow them for a short period. Then do so. Stannis offhandedly. Your mission could be as crucial as mine own. Not inclined to question a gift, Jon bowed his head. Thank you, Your Grace. Again, your thanks are unnecessary. The king sat down, resting his back rigidly against the support of the high seat. Your arguments are logical. The wildlings will be slaughtered at Hardham only to then join the enemy's ranks against us. It is simply a question of denying assets to our foe. This one is made of more ice than one of the others. Besides, there are women and children out there. It is the right thing to do. Sir Davos spoke up, earning him a hard look from his master. But, in the end, there was no disagreement. As I say, the king continued, returning his eyes to Jon, it is the logical course. Take the fleet to the North Waters and retrieve as many of the wildlings as you are able. How many men can I take with me, Your Grace? Jon said, his mouth seemingly having taken a life of its own. Men. Stannis repeated curiously, his face expressionless. that is dependent on the strength of the night's watch. Beyond the sailors I will not be sending any soldiers with you. They are needed here to garrison the wall. John nodded again. He had known it was a forlorn hope, but he thought quickly, considering that his men were enough. He was after all not expecting a fight. The sudden success on this issue was enough to spur him to another action. Your Grace, if we are discussing the wildlings. I visited Hardin's tower to speak to Val. Ah yes, Raida's good sister. The king muttered. I have spoken to her myself. She made representations to spare Raida. The king's voice was cold. I was not inclined to do so. That surprises me not at all. During my conversation with her, John went on doggedly, she stated that she believes that she may be able to locate those wildlings who fled west after you routed their host. She asked to be allowed to head north of the wall and find them. If Stannis Baratheon was a man given to smiling, John suspected he might have done so then. The woman is spirited. I'll give her that. His eyes hardened. She nearly killed one of my men-at-arms trying to escape. Wildling women are as tough, if not tougher, than the men. John offered lamely, his mind filled with images of Ygritte. They have to be. You do not feel that this is a ploy to escape? Sir Davos asked from the side. To what purpose? John looked across at him. The wildlings are a leaderless, directionless people, and Val knows it. He turned to direct his next comment to Stannis. What do we have to lose? If she runs, we've lost one prisoner. If she remains true and fulfills her purpose, she could bring yet more wildlings through the wall. He paused for effect. Your Grace mentioned something about denying the enemy additional troops. Davos Seaworth smiled again and shook his head slightly in admiration. Stannis stared for a moment and then nodded. Very well. Provision the woman and send her on her way. He dipped his head slightly. Remind her before we still have her sister's son. John blanched. The threat was obvious. The child is dead, Your Grace. Indeed. Stannis looked disdainfully at him as though he was somewhat simple. She, however, does not know that. The notion appalled him. However, he nodded in resignation. He had what he wanted. Thank you for the ships, Your Grace. I say once again, your thanks are unnecessary. Stannis stated, returning his eyes to the parchment in front of him. In any event, they are currently not being used. He paused as he shifted the pile of scrolls, clearly looking for one. I will hardly need them to visit the hill tribes. John started. You mean to travel to the mountains, Your Grace? Stannis eyed him with a measure of impatience, clearly wanting this audience to be at an end. That is where someone tells me the tribes congregate. His head twisted as though remembering. I need more men. In our first conversation you advised me to win the loyalty of the tribesmen and use them to break the Boltons and other traitors in the north. He once again looked directly at John. You tell me that there are a number of northern houses that I can call upon to fight the rebels. I would vow it, Your Grace. John said earnestly, the likes of the Boltons, Whitehills and Dustins may have rebelled, but my family has many loyalists. With my father and brother south of the neck there is no one to rally behind. His tone was full of conviction. He was adamant in his own mind that if the Boltons were faced with real, coordinated opposition, the North would rise against them. Then we shall provide them with such. Stannis stated matter-of-factly. I have need of allies. I face an enemy north of the wall, an enemy of undetermined size and strength. I would not fight them with an enemy to the south of me at the same time. Therefore, the rebels must be destroyed so that attention is not diverted. The king's face became very still. The north must be freed. As soon as possible. Freed. Freed to serve you, you mean? John thought. Northern honor would demand no less. Behind him the gruff knight Davos Seaworth smiled wildly as if proud that his leader had heeded John's advice. It seemed wrong to John, dishonorably self-serving in some ways. Despite the king's words, he saw the real intent behind the words being uttered. A tactical decision not to fight on two fronts it might be, but, in fighting a campaign to remove the rebels and unifying the north against them, Stannis would fashion a unified weapon with which to fight the enemy, win then the loyalty of the north and then press his claim for the throne. This man is incredibly long-sighted. He thinks 2 or 3 moves ahead. A dangerous opponent should he ever become one. But then, he reflected in the next instant. Did it matter? It had been Jon who had pushed for the expedition to Hardham, it was he who supported Val's plan. Stannis had agreed to both proposals and was actively supporting the first. Jon made to leave. He was intercepted at the door to the tower steps by the Lady Melisandre. Night was approaching and Jon suspected she was here to accompany the king on their daily walks along the top of the wall. It had been a regular occurrence since the Baratheon host had arrived at Castle Black. The lady was close to him, so close that he could smell the exotic perfume she wore, feel the heat that radiated from her body. Though she wore only a simple robe and seemed to demur from the furs and heavy cloaks that most on the wall preferred, she did not seem cold or even slightly uncomfortable. If only the rest of us could feel that way. Jon bowed his head thinking of the fire white he has seen earlier. Though if that is the type of gift the Lord of Light bestows, it is one I would rather decline. Jon attempted to move past her with an apology, but the woman stopped him with a raised hand. The Lord of Light has shown me much, Jon Snow. Beware of daggers in the dark. He paused and frowned at her. Is that a threat, my lady? The Red Woman looked seriously at him, her face pinched in concern. Not from me. It is a warning. Keep your wolf about you, Jon Snow. With that she left him in the entranceway and walked to the king. The next day saw the execution of Mance Rayder. A single stroke from Longclaw claimed the man's life. As fortune would have it, it was not the only execution that day. Janos Slynt followed Mance to the executioner's block barely an hour later after he refused a direct order from Jon to take provisions to the Shadow Tower. It was unexpected. Jon had been assigning missions and commands and he had wanted Slynt away from Castle Black while he travelled north. He had not anticipated Slynt refusing a direct order to leave. Yet, refuse the man had, with a smile on his face. A smile that had disappeared quickly when Jon called for his sword to conduct the execution. It was the only response. Shaken but not deterred from his course, Jon started to make preparations for the journey to Hardham. He was delayed, however, by the sudden arrival of Aelys Karstark at the gates of Castle Black. The maid was suffering from the cold and malnutrition, but before she collapsed, she managed to relay to Jon and Stannis that she had fled to the wall in response to her great-uncle Arnulf siding his forces with Roose Bolton's rebellion. It transpired that Lord Rickard Karstark was dead and that his heir, Haryon, was in the south, his fate unknown. Arnulf Karstark had seized control of Karhold and intended Aelys to be forcibly wed to his own son Cregan to legitimize their claim. Cregan is doubtless pursuing me even now. Aelys had gasped, looking forlornly at Jon. You are my only hope, Lord Snow. In your father's name, I beg you. Protect me. Lord Snow. Once it was an insult, a reminder of my base-born status. Now the title means something else. Jon agreed to help the girl and had dispatched rangers to intercept Cregan Karstark, who was indeed riding in pursuit. The group from Karhold were arrested and its members, including an indignant Cregan, imprisoned in the ice cells. There, Jon declared, they would remain until the outcome of the rebellion was decided. Through the pain and his dull visions, Jon wondered what had become of Aelys this night. Had those that had done this to him given the potential heir of Karhold any thought in their plans, or had they been as short-sighted about her as they had been everything else? He knew she had struck up a friendship with Signorn, the Magna of Thun. Jon had seen the two walking together outside near the stockade where the Thuns were being kept. The two figures looking odd together, and yet there seemed to be affection growing between them. Sigorn is a fighter. He will protect her. Jon reasoned as a wave of pain took him. There were even some that said that they had been holding hands at the ceremony where some of the wildlings, Signorn included, had pledged loyalty to King Stannis, a ceremony that had been marked by the burning of the fabled Horn of Winter, the instrument that had been displayed to Jon when he had been in Mance Rayder's tent. With the horn's possible power well known and, unwilling to take the chance that the legend might be true, Stannis had ordered it to be consigned to the flames. Jon had stood watching the fire lick higher and higher, spying Aelys and Sigorn standing opposite the burning pile. The woman looked frail but resolute against the perils life had thrown at her. Even so, Jon saw the look the Wilderling chieftain gave her then. Sigorn is a fighter. He will protect her. Cold. So cold. He could barely feel anything now. His hands were dropping from his wounds, the strength ebbing away as his life faded. Death was close. He could feel it. If he could, he would have smiled at the thought. It is not the first time I have seen death. The day after Alis' arrival, Jon left for Eastwatch and embarked on his journey to Hardham. Tormund coming with him to try and convince the fellow leaders of his people to accept Jon's offer. They had arrived along the shoreline by Hardham, a sparse coastal village that enabled the wildlings to eke out a living from the fishing waters. The settlement was set against a series of high cliffs that protected its inhabitants from the rough winds. A rough makeshift wall surrounding a settlement of rickety buildings that looked like they had been in place for hundreds of years. Rotten and neglected. There were far more wildlings inhabiting the barren place than Jon had expected. To his estimation, there appeared to be thousands of men, women and children packed into the walls of the dilapidated settlement. Jon, Tormund and Dolorous Ed led a small number of rowboats ashore to speak to the wildling leaders. The hostile faces meeting Jon as they neared the rudimentary docks did not fill Jon with confidence, but there was no going back. The meeting initially went worse than Jon had feared. First, Tormund had killed the Lord of Bones, who had met them off the docks and had proceeded to insult Tormund for being among the hated crows. Tormund beat the man to death with his own club and then called a meeting of elders in one of the settlement's larger buildings. Jon had been allowed to make his proposal to the elders, that they allowed the watch to take them back to the wall and allow them through to settle on the provision that they aid King Stannis and the Night's Watch against the threat of the others. He pulled from his cloak a pouch of dragon-glass weapons that had been collected by the watch, a good faith gesture that Jon hoped would prove his intentions to the hostile wildlings. Sam had said they were weapons against the others. He could think of no greater prize and hoped it might be seen as a genuine peace offering. He might as well have offered them poison for all the good it did. Lobada, an antagonistic Than, was furious at the proposal, refusing to place what was left of his people at the mercy of the Watch, the enemy of the wildlings for centuries. Many among the elders felt much the same. That being said, Tormund argued on Jon's behalf, reiterating that the threat they all faced was bigger than the conflict between either side of the wall. This is a battle of the living against the dead. Tormund rumbled, his holding the Lord of Bones club. Either we fight together or we die alone in the snow. You climbed the wall to try and claim Castle Black. A short but tough wildling woman named Karsai pointed out. I did. Tormund agreed with a shrug. Mans sent me there to try and open the way for our people. He regarded the group. We failed. We died. But, with all that, the crows are offering us a way to get to safety. You'd trust them? Lobada spat. The crows? No. Tormund answered, looking directly at Jon. I trust him though. He fights for the living. He took in the group. As do I. Jon had not known he had been so convincing when he had visited the cells where they had initially imprisoned Tormund after he had been captured after the attack on Castle Black. However, he stayed silent, merely nodding. The meeting had gone on for a while, but in the end over half the elders, representing around 3,000 souls, agreed to leave with Jon and the Watch. The rest refused. With a heavy heart, Jon left the building and ordered the men he had brought with him to return to the boats and return with the rest of the longboats. They would ferry the wildlings from the shore to the larger ships. He surveyed the center of Hardham, his gaze lingering on the bedraggled refugees. Hungry, frightened people that stared at the visitors with hostile eyes. At least some will be saved. What began next was a slow process. The wildlings who were leaving packed their meager belongings onto the longboats and were rowed out to the waiting fleet, where they and their belongings were brought on board. Hundreds still waiting transport began to pack the docks. The day drew on and the sun began to sink over the horizon. It was chaotic, but Jon and his men did his best to hasten the trips as much as possible. Jon himself lifted children from the docks and placed them in the boats. He did not receive a word of thanks, and nor did he expect one. And still the day wore on. It was Ed who noticed that something was wrong. He had turned from one of the docked boats, having assisted an old man to scramble aboard, when he suddenly stopped, his gaze fixed beyond Jon and looking off into the distance. What in the seven hells? Jon looked over his shoulder to see what had perplexed his friend. Out in the distance, beyond the palisade wall that made up Hardham's perimeter, there was a snowy mist that seemed to be moving at speed towards them. The wind had increased and the temperature, already cold past the point of freezing, seemed to be dropping rapidly. It looked like a snowstorm. But it seemed to be around the area just to the west of the village. Localized in such a small area and heading in Hardham's direction. The noise hit them next. The sound of thousands of beings moving towards them. It seemed as if they were yelling, but there were no discernible sounds beyond high-pitched snarling and grunting. It was coming through the mist. Towards them. John knew then that they were too late. An army of undead wights were concealed by the snowstorm. If John had to guess, they were heading towards the settlement. These were different than when Jaffa Flowers came back from the dead all those months ago. John's heart sank. The dead had come to claim Hardham. Knowing they were under attack, John commanded a few men to remain with the boats to supervise those still waiting to leave, while he drew his sword and led his men into the Wilderling settlement. The group of watchmen ran towards Hardham's wall, intent on trying to defend the wildlings as they began to run towards the docks. John even passed an elder who had refused the watch's offer of sanctuary a few hours before, now running towards the relative safety of the boats. John's men hastened towards the wall where a small group of Wilderling defenders had amassed, ready to face an oncoming threat. Beyond the fortifications a number of wildlings were running towards the gate, obviously fleeing the oncoming storm. Ahead of them Lobeda, swinging a massive battle axe, screamed at the men by the gate to swing it shut, ordering that they be barricaded against the incoming threats. But, once again, they were too late. The last thing John could see through the confusion was first the mist, then whatever was inside, suddenly overtake the wildlings, who were too slow to have made it inside the gate before it closed, cutting them off. Everywhere was screaming and fear. People were shouting and screaming whilst others had no idea what to do. They stared in confusion as the Wilderling warriors set about barring the wide door with whatever they could. That won't hold them, John thought as they arrived by the gate. A host of undead wights smashed into the perimeter wall, rocking the wooden surface as they crashed into it with wild abandon. The impact came with a sound akin to a clap of thunder, and for a heartbeat John feared the wall would collapse. However, the wall still stood, gods be good, but only just. The wights hacked at the rotten defense with crude tools that they had used before they died and joined the undead ranks. The sound of thrashing and scratches of frustration were all that came from the dead as they sought a way inside Hardham. The wall buckled at certain points and the dead came through, grey or white emaciated forms that were long devoid of human expression beyond hate and fury scrambled through the gaps they had caused. Their wild blue eyes dead but yet somehow still moving. They were more animal than man, like a pack of starving dogs on a hunt. And they acted like it. They fell upon Hardham's defenders with no hint of self-preservation. The wildlings were hard, capable fighters, well versed to battles for survival, but even they seemed daunted by the wights as they burst through holes in the wall and threw themselves with a crazed frenzy at the living who tried in vain to repel the enemy. Fire! John shouted as he swung Longclaw and took a whiter Wilderling from the look of it down at the knees and then impaling its torso into the snow. Use fire! He twisted his sword and pulled it free from the corpse as it shuddered and lay still. But no one could hear him, and if any of the defenders could, there was nothing they could do to follow his advice. Any fires within Hardham had guttered and died when the cold icy wind had struck the settlement. Their weapons seemed useless. John saw many wights struck by arrows or sword thrusts only to see the enemy absorb the strike and press on. The blows the dead received might knock them back or even throw them to the floor, but the dead still pushed forward. John saw a dead woman have a leg and arm removed courtesy of Laboda's axe, then rise from the cold ground as if nothing had happened. The wight still tried to pull itself towards the Torthan, intent on doing him harm in any way it could. Only another blow that severed the woman's head from its neck seemed to slow it down. Back! Laboda hollered at his men as he walked in reverse towards John, hacking at any wight within range as he did. So intent was he on the enemy coming through the holes in the gate, he neglected to see a wight pitch towards him from his blind side. Without thinking, John sprung forward and skewered the wight through the chest. The corpse unexpectedly crumpled in front of him, all fight gone from the creature's limbs. Counting his good fortune, John pulled Longclaw free and stepped beside Laboda. The Thun looked at him not with thanks but with a measure of respect. He would have said something, but their attention was diverted by sudden movement on the cliffs above them. From where they stood they could see skeletal figures on what looked to be horseback. They were watching the events below as though viewing a tourney field. like generals on a battlefield. The cold misty wind seemed to come from behind them as though they were the ones creating it. Perhaps they are. The dragon glass. John shouted urgently above the sounds of battle. We can use it against them. It's still in the hut. Laboda replied, gesturing wildly at the building where John and the elders had met earlier that day. The wildling's eyes were wide and afraid. He, like John, seemed to know that as deadly as what they had been facing up until now, this was nothing compared to what was up above them. John commanded Ed and Tormund to hold the line while he went for the dragon glass. He sprinted towards the hut with Laboda right behind him, out of concern or mistrust John could not say. They entered the hut practically side by side. John's eyes darted to where the pouch of glass sat on a bench exactly where he had left it. He moved forward to claim the pouch. The hut wall opposite them exploded inwards. Wooden debris that used to part of the hut's structure struck John about the face and he was knocked backwards onto the frozen floor. He was winded but he clambered to his feet. Only to be faced by another. A creature from hell. The ice warrior climbed through the hole in the hut's side and stepped gracefully into the room. Now he was close. John could see the figure's white skeletal face, the only color being its piercing blue eyes that took in the room. The creature was wearing some kind of frozen armor, almost glass, it being so smooth and fragile. The creature had long hair, all white and free behind the creature's back. It was unreal, like something seen in a dream or a nightmare. What was not a nightmare was the weapon in the creature's hands. It had the length of a spear but the second half of the shaft was shaped like sword. It too looked to be made from glass. Blinking, John readied his sword. I knew this moment would come from the moment I saw them near Craster's keep. Laboda uttered a guttural war cry and leapt forward. He raised his massive axe in his strong hands and brought it scything towards the other's head. The creature moved at supernatural speed, raising its weapon to block before John could think through what was happening. Upon impact the wilderling's axe shattered like dry wood being struck by castle-forged steel. The massive blade shattered and, as Laboda gaped in shock, the other continued moving through the arc of its parry and directed the blade's course so that it buried itself into the gut of the wilderling. The enemy wasn't yet done. It gathered itself and, before Laboda could even utter a groan of surprise, he was suddenly lifted from his feet and thrown across the room right at John. The wilderling hit him dead center with extreme force. The blow was like being struck in the chest with a warhammer. With a cry of surprised pain, John was smashed through the wall of the building and fell hard onto the ground outside. The air again fled his body as he gasped in pain. He had been struck before but never with such speed or strength. He rolled onto his front and regained his feet, though his footsteps were uneven, his balance hindered by what had happened. Still, he had no choice but to move. It was either that or wait to die. John had scrambled from the ruins of the building he had been smashed through, oblivious to the fighting and dying that was going all around him. He searched in vain for something he could use as some sort of defense against the creature that he knew would be on him at any moment. At that very moment the other burst from the building behind John, setting its long blade dice spear in front of it and marching towards his wounded opponent. John could have cursed. He was cut off from the cache of dragon glass he had brought with him. The one substance that might have aided him against this monster. He was forced to back up in the face of the walker as it made for him. The face was all icy composure, but John could read the creature's determination in its movement. It wants to finish what it started. John looked around him once again for a weapon and the sharp glint of steel caught his eye. With bated breath he pitched forward and reached into the snow and wreckage of the destroyed building, moving aside the debris until his fingers clasped the hilt of what his eyes had seen. Longclaw. I must have clung onto it when I was thrown from the hut. Thanking whatever gods there were that seemed to be looking over him. John seized his sword and raised it in just enough time to parry the swinging arc of the other's weapon. He didn't think it would matter. Longclaw was no match for the evidently magical blades of the other. He expected the ancestral blade of House Mormont to shatter as Laboda's axe had. The sword stopped the ice blade and the sound of the clash caused a high note to reverberate across the battle site. The world stopped as if time itself had frozen. John had stared at the blade in utter shock. Longclaw's smooth surface was untarnished as it held the blade in place a short distance from his body. His eyes were drawn to the face of the other and experienced another surprise. Gone was the monster's calm, focused countenance. Instead, the creature looked even more shocked than John felt. The ice demon's mouth almost hung open as it too stared at the blades that were locked together in a deadly standoff that mirrored the combatant's own. Then, as abruptly as that, the spell was broken. The other gave a grunt and then withdrew the blade and swung again. John reacted on instinct. He ducked out of the way to avoid the death blow and came up swinging. Strength isn't everything, lad, Sir Roderick had told him once in the training yard of Winterfell. Sometimes it's better to be fast than strong. Taking this lesson to heart, John attacked. He swung his own blade upwards, aiming for the undefended torso of the other. Praying to the old gods that he could find a chink in the monster's armor, that this one chance might give him at least a fighting prospect of survival. Longclaw struck the other and passed on through as though it was nothing but water. The sword strike was being hampered by the small ice blocks that emanated from John's foe as the creature shattered into 1,000 ice shards that were scattered to the winds. He regained his balance as he stared at the ground where the other had stood a moment before. He wished he could think through what had happened, but he knew this fight was far from done. The defense of Hardham had deteriorated yet further from when he had gone inside the hut. There were scarcely any of the wilderling fighters still on their feet. Bodies, both friend and foe, littered the ground. The palisade wall was on the verge of collapse and more wights were still coming through the holes to assault the warriors within. Once the wall came down they would be overrun. There was only one option: retreat. To the boats. John shouted at what wildlings defenders remained. Tormund heard him and nodded, passing the order on to his men. John ran for Ed, who was standing where a few of the watch still stood. "We're out of time. Everyone to the docks." Ed nodded in thankful agreement. "Common, lads. To the boats." Those still able ran as fast as they could towards the shore. Johns ignored the pain as he ran, knowing that if he stopped he would be overrun and killed. Around them he saw wounded and infirm wildlings being slain by the wights as they pursued those attempting to escape. He hated leaving people behind, but there was nothing he could do. He dared not look behind him lest he be unmanned by the sight of what was chasing them. The sounds alone are bad enough. They reached the docks. Now only a few longboats remained, some brave sailors clearly having waiting to evacuate the last few living souls still in Hardham. John leapt aboard, not caring about the wild panic that gripped him as he went over the side and hit the deck of the boat hard. The sailors needed no prompting as they pushed away from the docks and out into deeper water. It took but a moment, as heart-stopping as it was, to reveal that the wights were not willing, or able, to go into the water. Something to remember. John got to his feet, recovering his breath. He looked back at Hardham as the boat that had saved him slipped away towards the fleet. The settlement had fallen to the undead. There were corpses everywhere, bodies lay all over the cold ground. Men, women, children. The wights did not discriminate in those they killed. Some had been slain with weapons, others had been ripped apart, fresh blood flowing from bite marks and wounds made as the victims were torn limb from limb. John could see no sign that there were survivors. There was nothing alive left in Hardham. Yet movement had not ceased. The wights still moved about looking for anyone or anything that still lived. However, the vast majority were gathered by the dock, their blue eyes following the boats as they moved away from them. The two groups watched each other like two armies sizing each other up. Though, here, there was no doubt which was the vanquished force in this engagement. Then, as though by some unspoken command, the dead parted, allowing a tall figure to move through their ranks. It was undoubtedly another, moving with purpose and poise through the shambling horde that formed the vast majority of the undead army. This other, though, looked different from the one that John had faced, and from the one he had seen at Craster's. Its armor seemed older, more ornate. He had no hair on his head but a series of horns that formed a sort of crown that gave it a regal bearing. In that moment of sheer terror, even John's tired brain managed to process that the figure before him was the great enemy of myth and legend. The one he had heard about from Old Nan. He did not know how he knew, he just knew that the figure, if indeed such a title could be given to this entity, was none other than the Night's King. The greatest foe of the Watch and, indeed, all of mankind. The Night King had stood on the makeshift dock watching as John and his men rowed furiously into deeper water. The other watched with no expression as more of its kind stepped from the mass of wights and came up behind it, flanking it as though they were an honor guard. Then, without prompting, the Night King lifted its arms in unspoken command, to who John and his allies could not determine. Then, suddenly, there was movement across Hardham. The corpses stirred and got to their feet. No matter how injured the corpses were, they still rose at the other's command. John could only watch in horror as the dead wildlings rose from the dead and joined the host already present in the settlement. At another silent command they turned to stare out at the boats. A stare of cold blue eyes whose piercing glare could be felt by the survivors of Hardham long after they reached the fleet and sailed south towards the wall. I saw him. Gods, I saw him. The threat of the Night's King had changed John's thinking as he sailed back to Eastwatch and certainly informed his decisions when he rode through the gates of Castle Black. He was disappointed to find that, in his absence, King Stannis had gone to meet the mountain clansmen. It was reported that once the king had obtained their support against the Boltons, he then intended to ride to Last Hearth to try to enlist their aid before they marched on the dread fort. The man is nothing if not efficient. He moves fast. He was also surprised to find that Queenslis, Stannis' wife and the mother of his only child, had journeyed to Castle Black and taken up residence in the King's Tower. John had met her briefly when he went through Eastwatch. A severe, dour woman, the young Lord Commander had not liked the woman, but he had pushed his feeling aside. It was not important in the great scheme of things. Stannis had taken Sir Davos and Justin Massey with him on his journey south, but he had left his hand, Lord Alistair Florent, in charge of the Baratheon garrison at Castle Black. An older noble, who seemed ill-suited to the position of hand during wartime but still charming and kind in a patrician way. John had sat down with the man, relayed what had happened and said that he was willing to allow wildlings to settle on the gift. We need the men, and I would be a fool to rely on Stannis, or indeed anyone, at this stage. The wildlings know they will not be welcome anywhere in the southern kingdoms, and yet they can still use the wall as a shield to defend them. This had not been popular, to say the very least. Sir Alliser Thorne had called him a traitor in the meeting where he announced the decision. John had not tried to justify his actions beyond saying that old hatreds did not matter when faced with an enemy that wanted to destroy those who lived. His standing within the Watch was further damaged when, a few days later, Val returned from her expedition beyond the wall and came back with hundreds of wildlings that she had found. Since the new arrivals were willing to accept Stannis' terms, John allowed them through the wall. You have just given them access to something your brothers died to prevent. Thorne snarled at him when John gave the order. Or perhaps you forget. An image of Ygritte flashed through his mind. Biting back his natural response, John had turned to him and the other brothers who had made objections to him. I forget nothing, Sir Alliser. It is better they are through the wall than left on the other side to join the dead. Sir Alliser's dark eyes flashed. They are our enemy, Lord Snow. They are savages. This plan of yours and Stannis to have them fight with us is a folly. His head tilted quizzically, or was Slynt right when he said you turned your cloak and joined their side? Maybe you merely want to save your own. John knew he had to be careful, but the anger flared. I fought beside my brothers defending this very castle, killing wildlings to do so. After you joined them and traversed the wall so that they could attack us from behind. Alliser spat at him as he stalked away angrily, accompanied by quite a few of the Watch. Several of which had voted for John just a few weeks ago. It was not the last of John's troubles. Bowen Marsh remained with a few others to complain that the Watch were supporting Stannis in his bid for the throne. Not only that, but locally the Watch was sheltering Aelys Karstark and imprisoning her relative Cregan. We are taking sides in the internal conflicts of the Seven Kingdoms, Lord Commander. Marsh pointed out. His words were his own, but John suspected that he was more of a figurehead for the complaints of other individuals. It is not something that the Night's Watch should be involved with. That is an overstatement, Bowen. John said, maintaining his calm. Cregan's confinement is temporary and Aelys has asked for sanctuary. And Stannis? Marsh said, his round face even redder than usual. We need him. John replied wearily. We need men to fight the others, and they are the only forces available. For the moment. Bowen shot back. But what if the Bolton beat Stannis or the Starks arrive and fight both sides? He crossed his arms. What do we do then? What position will we find ourselves in? We will deal with that as and when. John said as he tried to walk away. He did not have the time or the energy to deal with scenarios that had not happened yet. Bowen stepped in front of him, almost barring his path. "We are neutral, John. It is the only way we can survive." "No, the only way to survive is to unite against our common enemy." John tried to placate the officers, but he achieved very little during the fruitless discussion. When he finally took his leave, it was to angry murmurs and, he had no doubt, dark glances. The following night during the evening meal in the Great Hall, a rider had arrived declaring that Stannis had left the mountains and was heading south to Last Hearth. The rider reported that if Last Hearth was in rebel hands, then Stannis' intention was to take it. After that he would push on to Winterfell, to liberate it, if necessary. Gods, the man is relentless. Additional troops had been called upon from the Baratheon host, and these included the wildlings who had sworn allegiance to Stannis. Not only that, but the rider had a letter where Stannis had asked Jon to travel south to Winterfell so that he could vouch for Stannis' intentions and good faith should he encounter the Starks or any loyal to them. Would that I knew what his Grace's full and true intentions were. Jon made an instant decision. He stood and declared he would be riding south with the wildlings and Baratheon reinforcements. No other Night's Watch member would go with him or be involved in conflicts south of the wall, but he would leave at dawn. As he predicted, the result was uproar. He left the hall to the angry sounds of his brothers shouting accusations of treason whilst arguing amongst themselves. Jon had no inclination to talk anymore about the Watch's neutrality. He left the Great Hall and headed towards his chambers. Night had fallen, the only illumination that of torches and brazier fires lighting the way. He was diverted by a commotion at the entrance to Hardin's Tower. A wildling giant has been sat outside the tower preventing access when Jon had gone for the evening meal, yet now the creature was surrounded by members of the Watch, their swords drawn. The giant swung his mighty fist left and right, roaring unintelligibly. "What in seven hells?" Jon hurried over. "What is the meaning of this?" Then he saw the body. He recognized the broken corpse as belonging to Sir Patrek of King's Mountain. A knight in King Stannis' service and a favorite of Queen Lys. It took a moment for Jon to guess what had happened. The knight had no doubt been trying to gain access to the tower in an attempt to woo Val. The giant had clearly objected and matters had got out of hand. Jon raised his hands trying to placate the giant while herding his men away. "No one else needs to die today." As he had successfully calmed the giant, Jon turned to address his men only to feel a piercing pain in his gut. He was facing Bowen Marsh, who had tears glistening on his cheek and a blood-red knife in his hand. "For the Watch," the steward whispered as he stabbed him again. Jon tried to move backwards, but the blade cut deep. Next came Wick Whittlestick, Alisa Thorne and a half-dozen others. Each struck hard and left him mortally wounded on the floor. Daggers in the dark. The thought hit Jon, and the cruel irony cut as deeply as the knife's had. He had spent all his time cheating death with the wildlings and the others, and it would end in the safety of Castle Black. Delivered to the arms of death by his own brothers. He had been warned and he had ignored it. Dismissed it as mystical nonsense. It was almost over now. Jon knew. He could feel it. His life's blood had flowed out of his body till it was almost nothing but a trickle. His hands were cold and lifeless. His body felt so heavy he could hardly move. Jon felt his hands start to lower from his chest wounds once again. The combination of weak arms and the slippery nature of the blood made purchase impossible. He could take it no longer. It was too much effort. His body failed him and he rolled onto his back to stare aimlessly at the night sky. Yet, even that was becoming blurry now. The sounds of battle were receding. The echoes of swords clashing fading into nothingness. What would happen next? He wondered about the Night's Watch, the wildlings, even Stannis Baratheon. Would they join together? Would his father and brother return to the north? So many questions. And now he would never know. It gave him depressing thoughts. But even those were fading now. Suddenly his vision was filled by fiery red colors. As though the stars above had been wiped out in a torrent of fire. He forced his eyes to focus and he took in the Lady Melisandre as she came and knelt beside him. "Lord Commander," she whispered sensuously, taking his blood-covered hand in her own. Her eyes were wide in consternation. "My vision was true. But I did not see the full nature of the threat until it was too late. Does it matter now?" The Red Woman leaned forward, inspecting the wounds as a maester might inspect an interesting animal they had never seen before. She extended an arm and moved aside John's jerkin, examining him more closely. Pain shot through him. "Leave it," he implored her. "It is too late. It is over." Lady Melisandre gave a small smile as she moved close to his ear. "You know nothing, Jon Snow. The end."